In this course, you'll learn how to use Next.js and Cloudinary to build a Google Photos clone, and you'll learn how to make the app transform and enhance the images. Colby Fayock created this course. Colby is a popular course creator and is great at breaking things down for beginners. Colby works for Cloudinary, who provided a grant to make this course possible.
Images are a fundamental part of our everyday lives, giving us the opportunity to capture a moment in time and share it with the world, or maybe just enjoy it ourselves. But what do we do when we have all those images? Which is increasingly challenging now that most of us have a smartphone in our pocket that has a pretty impressive camera. So we're going to see how we can take those images, put them into some kind of storage to create a media library where we're going to be able to not only upload those images, but transform them, such as cropping and resizing. We're going to use AI to enhance those images. And we're even going to see how we can add some filters and some fun effects like remove the background to really transform our images into something new. Particularly, we're going to pretty much build a Google Photos clone, where if you're not familiar with the concept, it's pretty much that media library I was talking about, where once you have all of your images uploaded to your library, you can start to do things like editing them, where maybe I want to improve that image with AI, or use AI to remove the background. Or we can also do things like cropping, where I can dynamically crop it to a common format, and I can even add filters such as maybe I want to have this image a cooler tone. But one of my favorite parts is taking this a step further with those creations, where maybe I want to include a couple images and I want to create a collage out of them. I can easily select the images that I want. I can trigger the action to create a collage, and now I have my beautiful collage that I can save to my library, and now I can share with my friends. So through this tutorial, we're going to cover a wide variety of topics of how we can build this app inside of Next.js, including first off, how do we actually upload our images to the cloud, where we're going to use a drop-in upload widget that makes it really easy to upload our images directly to our media library. Now, once they're up inside of our Cloudinary account, how do we get them out? So we're going to see how we can list those images using Next.js server components and then pass that data to the client using Tanstack Query, where we can interact with it, such as adding to that list after upload. Now, once we have all of our images actually in our library, we want to be able to view those images and transform them like we talked about. So we're going to see how we can use dynamic routes, where we can set up a page for every single one of those images, where we can start to do all those different editing options, like using AI to transform it, the dynamic cropping and resizing, the filters, and even just simply adding some metadata and giving the ability to delete that image. Now, back to one of my favorite parts is those creations. How can we have some more advanced options, such as creating API endpoints, where I want to be able to create all those different features and creations, such as animations, collages, and even color pop. So we're going to see how we can dive into these different features and create really advanced syntax in order to create dynamic experiences with all of our images. Now, rather than trying to rebuild this entire UI from scratch, we're going to use a starter template that's just going to give us some more of the basic layout features. Now, in order to get started with this, you can find this repo over on my GitHub. It's demo photo library starter, or you should be able to find the link inside of the description of this video. Now, before we dive in, if you want to see the completed project that I took beyond this tutorial, you can check it out at photobox.dev, where I have it completely open source, where you can easily spin up your own photo library completely built. You just need to plug in your Cloudinary account. Now, once we get started, we can scroll down and we can see we're going to run this command in order to get started. You can also clone this repo if you want, but I recommend running this create next app command, where I'm going to copy that to my clipboard. And I'm going to pull up my terminal and run this command, where we can see that what's going to happen is it's going to download that repository to my local environment. It's even going to install the dependencies and reset Git history, which is important for starting off with a new project. So I'm going to now navigate to my photo library. I'm going to run npm run dev, where it's going to start up a local server, where I can now open that up inside of my browser. And as soon as this project loads, we can see we have the exact same starter template. So now that we have our project started, we can head over to our code editor, where let's take a quick look about what's inside. Where if I start navigating to my source, my app directory, where we're primarily going to work out of is the page file, which we can see this grouping under pages. And I'm doing that so I can have a custom layout for just that page. But then we can see we also have the resources page, where this is going to be where we're going to have our individual page for every single image, so we can have that dynamically created. We'll see how we can get to that later in the tutorial. But we're primarily going to be working out of these two pages. We're also going to be working out of some components, including a media gallery component, as well as a media viewer component, where because we're opting into SSR or server-side rendering for the core of the page, we want to be able to use some client-side features to actually be able to interact with our images inside of the application. So we can see we're using components to do that. We're appending use client at the top of those, where we can then take advantage of some of the client-side APIs. Now, it's also worth noting while we're digging in here is we're using shadcn to build a lot of the UI. So inside of this UI directory, you're going to be able to find all the components that were installed using shadcn, where you have the ability to customize them or even add your own shadcn UI components. In addition to shadcn, we're using Tailwind in order to actually do the UI styling. But before we get started, feel free to pause the video and take a minute to get familiar with your project before we dig in. Now, once we're ready to actually start building the project, the first thing we want to do is list out our images. Now, in order to do this, of course, you need a Cloudinary account. So head over to cloudinary.com and sign up for free. If you want to get 3 bonus credits for your free account, make sure you head over to cld.media/freeCodeCamp or check out the link in the description where you can claim your credits. But once you have your account and you're all logged in, we're ready to go. We're going to use the Node.js integration in order to easily list out all of our images using a server component inside of Next.js. So to start off, let's head back to our terminal. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to run npm install Cloudinary. Where once it's finished installing, we're going to head back over to our code editor, where inside we're going to first import the Cloudinary SDK. So at the top of app pages page, where the page that I want to actually list my files in, I'm going to import v2 as Cloudinary from Cloudinary. Now, the important thing to note here is that v2 is that top level import. So we want to make sure that we import v2, but we're going to import it as Cloudinary for convenience. But once we have that imported, the first thing we need to do is actually configure our Cloudinary account. So I'm going to add my cloudinary.config, where inside we're going to define 3 things. We're going to define our cloud name, our API key, and our API secret. Now let's go grab those values. Now, inside of your Cloudinary account, you can find your credentials right at the top of your programmable media dashboard. Now, that's inside of your Cloudinary account. Make sure you select programmable media on this left sidebar, and under dashboard, you should be able to see your product environment credentials. Now, depending on when you created your account, it might look slightly different, but generally speaking, you should be able to find these. You can also note that you can always find your API keys inside of settings and under access keys. So make sure that you have different ways of being able to find the keys that you need to configure your account. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and just use these environment credentials at the top of my dashboard, where we can see we have our cloud name, our API key, and our API secret. So I'm going to start copying these into the application, starting off with the cloud name. And as we're starting to configure our Cloudinary account, the one thing you want to consider is how you're actually managing these credentials. Now, just using the cloud name, if all you're doing is maybe some client side or maybe just grabbing images from your Cloudinary account, your cloud name can probably just be added inside of the code. But we're going to be working with both our cloud name as well as our API key and our API secret. So we don't want to store those in the code just to make sure that those don't get compromised if we accidentally commit them to Git or something along those lines. So let's use environment variables to configure this. So inside of the root of my project, I'm going to create a new file called .env.local. And I'm going to start off by creating next public Cloudinary cloud name, and I'm going to set that equal to my cloud name. Now, note, I'm appending next public in front of Cloudinary cloud name, which is important because we want this publicly available, or we want this available in the client where we'll later use client-side interactions. So we want to make sure that we have next public Cloudinary cloud name. Now, we're also going to want next public Cloudinary API key, where the API key is intended to be used in the client, or at least allowed to be used in the client. So we're going to make that public as well, because we'll be using that for uploading later. But then we're going to use our Cloudinary API secret. And note, it's important that you do not add next public in front of this API key, because this is only supposed to be used on the server. This should not be shared with anybody. So let's now fill out those other keys. So starting off with the API key, I'm going to go ahead and copy that. I'm going to go ahead and add it to my variable and then my API secret, and I'm going to go ahead and add it here. Now, no, I shouldn't be showing you this API secret, but because I'm using a temporary account, I'm going to reset the credentials, but I want you to kind of see how it's actually going to look when you're adding it to your project. So just be sure you don't ever share these API keys in secret with anybody else other than trying to configure your environment. But now moving back into where we're configuring those, let's start to add them with process.env.nextPublic And let me make sure I hide myself to not cover this. Cloudinary API key. I'm going to also add the API secret. And I'm going to do the same thing with my cloud name and be sure to remove next public from the API secret and update cloud name. But now that it's configured, let's actually start using the SDK. So I'm going to first hide my sidebar here to give us a little bit more room. But at the top of my home component, I'm going to add constant results is equal to await cloudinary.api.resources. And we're using the resources method to start, which is just going to give us all the resources inside of our account. Now, there's different ways that you can query your resources, whether it's by tag, which we'll see later, and other ways. You can even search your media library. But for now, let's start with resources. And we're going to go ahead and just console log out the results to see what's inside. Now, inside of your Cloudinary account, you should have some images already inside, whether it's a brand new account or an existing account with some of your own images. But if it is a brand new account, Cloudinary automatically places some sample images in there so that we have something to work with to get started. If we head back into our site and we try to refresh the page, I'm going to go ahead and open up my developer tools, and we're not actually seeing anything in there. So let me pull up my terminal actually, where if we look inside, let me hide myself, we actually see all the data there. And the reason we see this is because this query is actually running on the server. It's not running inside of the client, hence why we're seeing it inside of our terminal, and we're not actually seeing it in the browser in our developer tools. And that's completely expected because we're using SSR or server-side rendering in order to get that value and using the node integration in doing so. But that's a good thing because now we can make those requests on the server and we can pass it along to the client so that we don't have to include all those resources in JavaScript in order to get that over to the browser. So now let's actually try to loop through these and display them on the page. So looking just quickly back at the results, we're going to see that we have a top level property of resources, and that's going to contain the array of everything that we actually need. So heading back to our code editor, we know that inside of results, we're going to get our resources, if I spell that right. So let's actually take those resources and we're going to just pass it along to Media Gallery because Media Gallery is already expecting a prop of resources, and we're going to look inside to see how we can actually configure it to use our Cloudinary resources. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pass that along inside. So Media Gallery is now getting those dynamic resources. Now let me navigate over to Media Gallery, and just to open up the sidebar here, we're going into Components, Media Gallery, and the Media Gallery component, where we can see we're getting these resources. Currently, it's just expecting an array of those resources, and it's just getting the ID. Now we need to do a little bit of configuration here because it's expecting a Cloudinary resource. The funny thing is, if we look inside of the browser, we already see that we're getting something working. We can see that we have a bunch of instances of that Cloudinary logo, but that's because it's just looping through that array and it's just adding a static image. So now let's make that dynamic so it's actually showing the image inside of our account. Now back inside of the code, rather than continuing with this manually created object inside of that array, I'm going to go ahead and start a new interface, and I'm going to call that Cloudinary resource because I know I'm going to use that later for other purposes. So I'm going to go ahead and replace that ID. And next, I'm going to start off by adding some of the details that are going to be inside of this Cloudinary resource. Now looking again inside of the terminal, hiding myself, we're going to be using a few different aspects of this. We're going to use the public ID, which is just an identifier for that particular asset. We're going to use things like the secure URL, which is going to actually give us that URL. We're going to use the width and the height, and we're going to probably be using other things later, but for now, let's just add those 4 things. So on the Cloudinary resource, let's start defining this. I'm going to have my height, which is going to be a number. I'm going to have my width, which is going to be a number. I have my public ID, which is going to be a string, as well as my secure URL. So I have my height, my public ID, my secure URL, and my width. And that for now is going to represent my Cloudinary resource. Now, just to make sure we do have some type errors going on here, we can see that the code is currently referencing that ID. Let me hide myself here. We see that we have resource ID, and that was just for some temporary code so that when we spun up the starter, we actually saw something. So I'm going to replace all these IDs. I'm just going to multi-select all these by using Command D after I highlighted one of them. And I'm going to simply change it to public ID. And let me make sure I get everything. We have a few more instances here. I'm just going to select them all. And of course, I'm going to update those as well to public ID. Now, in addition to the public ID, we also want to make sure that we're actually using the dynamic data from that resource. So if we look at this image tag here, we can see we have the width, height, and the source. So I'm going to go ahead and update all those. Resource.width. We also have our resource.height, and we have our resource.secure URL. Now we don't have any alt value right now, and obviously it's not going to be a Cloudinary logo, so let's go ahead and just get rid of that string. But now we can see we're pulling all of our assets from our Cloudinary library, whether it's just the samples that came with a new account or anything that you might have added. So we can see, we can scroll through, we can see all of these. This one looks blank, but it's actually just a white logo on white background, so that's why you can't really see it. But we can see that we have all of our images displaying on the page. So starting off, we're going to get started with one of the more basic but impactful features of Cloudinary, and that's optimization. Now, if we head over to our network tab, and let me hide myself, and we filter on our images, we can see, let me refresh the page, that they're all a decent size. They're a couple hundred kilobytes each. They're getting served as JPEGs, as PNGs. And what's happening are these images are getting served as is. Cloudinary doesn't automatically optimize those images by default. What it does is it returns the uploaded photo by default, where you need to opt into optimization. But we can easily do so where we're going to use a new library to accomplish this called Next.Cloudinary, which is going to allow us to have an easy to use component inside of a Next.js application, as well as some other stuff that we'll see later, like uploading. And we could technically do this using the Node integration. We could easily construct our URLs to do this, but we get a lot more features with this additional Next.js integration. If you want to learn more or see the documentation for Next.Cloudinary, you can head over to next.cloudinary.dev, where if you click Get Started, you can see all the components available, including CldImage, which we're about to use, as well as the CldUpload widget and others, where we're going to be able to use uploading really easily with the CldUpload widget. So let's get started with the CldImage. So inside of my terminal, I'm going to hide myself and run npm install Next.Cloudinary. And once that's installed, I'm going to head back to VS Code, and we don't actually need to configure anything, because if we look back inside of our .env.local, we already have set up our next public Cloudinary cloud name. And that's literally all we need in order to use the components that we're going to use. Now, the upload widget will use the next public Cloudinary API key. And again, we already have that configured, so we don't need to do anything aside from actually importing the components. But what we now can do is we can head back over to our media gallery component, where again, that's under components, media gallery. And this is where we're going to be working out of for that gallery. I can now import my CLD image component from Next.Cloudinary. And what I can do now is I can head down to the bottom of my file where I have this image, and I'm going to just simply swap that image tag for my CLD image. And that didn't paste right, of course. But now we have it's a drop-in replacement for the image tag, as long as you have the width, the height, the source, and the alt, so it's really easy to configure. Now, the only caveat there is instead of the source being our secure URL, which technically it can accept URLs with a version in it, we want to use the public ID, as it's going to just to be a little bit more confident in how we're using it, or just a little bit more flexible. So I'm going to go ahead and update this to resource.public ID, so that I'm passing in my Cloudinary public ID to the source of my CLD image. But everything else can remain the same. And now that I'm heading back to my browser with my dev server restarted, I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page so we can see this network tab. But after the page compiles and loads, we can see that it's looking a little bit different. We can see that we're getting a bunch of WebP requests instead of all those JPEGs. Now let's just kind of hone in on one. We can see this top one, CLD sample 5. We have now a WebP file, and we have it being served at 140 kilobytes. And generally speaking, most of these files are definitely smaller than they were when we were serving them before. Sure, some of them are still a few hundred kilobytes because they're big files, but generally speaking, they're now being served optimized. Now, two things are happening here, and let me open up this one as an example, or I'm going to pull myself back in. If we look at the URL here, first off, we see this fauto. What fauto is going to do is it's going to return the most efficient format automatically. So what that means is, depending on the browser and the device, the browser might support different formats that are more efficient than others. Where in this case, the most efficient format that my account and my browser supports is WebP. Now, in some accounts, you might be upgraded to AVIF depending on your use case. There's also some other modern formats potentially coming down the line, like JPEG XL. But for now, we have the format that's being delivered for my case, which is going to be WebP. Now, also looking at QAuto, that's going to automatically compress the image to a point where it's not going to visually distort the image. So we're going to get the most automatic, or the most compression possible, while still maintaining the visual quality of the image itself. So we're having kind of two effects there in how we're optimizing it to deliver as small of an image as we can with the highest quality. Now, we also see that we're also passing this C limit, where we're passing a width of 3,840, and that's actually coming from responsive sizing, or in this case, we haven't quite configured all the responsive sizing yet, so we'll get to that in a second. But what this is doing is it's resizing it to 3,840, or because we're using CLimit, it's only going to resize down from a higher value, and it will never upscale. Now, if this was instead C-scale, it would potentially upscale it to that value if the image itself is smaller, but because we're using limit, it will not upscale, and it'll only downscale if it's a smaller value than the image itself. Now, as you'll notice, all these are parameters that are getting added to the URL. And this is going to be our transformation API, which allows us to customize and edit and modify how the image is getting created and delivered. Now, there's a whole lot of different things you can do, and you can construct these manually if you want, but the library is going to handle this for us and give us a little bit more of an easier way to interact with it and achieve the different transformations that we want. If you want to learn about all the different transformations that are available, you can head over to the transformation URL API reference on the Cloudinary documentation. But going back to our project, I alluded to responsive sizing. Now let's quickly just inspect one of our images. Let's keep with that CLD image 5, where if we look at that URL, hide myself again, we see that we have our width, our height. That's the ones that we defined, or rather, that's what came dynamically from the resource request. But then if we look at source set, we can see that it's currently defining these URLs. We're seeing those parameters. But if we see this width is dynamic, depending on the size. Now, by default, the component which wraps the Next.js image component is only going to give us a 1x image and a 2x image. So that's why you can see the way that the images are configured with those different widths. But we can add additional configuration to take advantage of more complex responsive sizing. Now, in order to take advantage of that responsive sizing, all we really need to do is define this sizes prop. And like I mentioned, the CLD image component wraps the Next.js image component. So this is a feature that we actually inherit directly from Next.js. But as we can see for this particular example, we're using media query sizing, where we can say we want to have a max width of 768 for a 100 viewport width image. We have our different configuration for 1200, and then finally the default of 33 viewport width. So we can add something similar to our own project. If we head back to the code, I'm going to start off by adding a sizes prop, and I'm just going to simply set this to 100 viewport width. If we head back to the code, we can already see that we have a completely different looking source set where we have a lot of different sizes available. I'm going to stop hovering, but if you try to look on the right-hand side where our source set is for that image tag, we can see all those different size parameters, and they're going to have different dynamic values inside of the Cloudinary URL. So now if we try to refresh the page with a smaller viewport size, and I start to increase the size of the browser, we can see that it's going to keep loading the bigger sizes and only load the smaller sizes at the smaller viewports. Now, we only have it configured to be a 100 viewport width image right now, and we can have better dynamic sizing based off of the sizes that we have where we're showing these grid of images. So back in my code, I'm going to go ahead and just paste this value in, where we can see that we have a default of 50 viewport width. I have, when it's 768, we have a 3 column grid. So I'm going to do 33 viewport width. When we have 1024, I'm going to do a 4 grid, and 1280, we have a 5 image grid. But ultimately what that sizes prop will do is help the browser determine what image to show out of that source set list based off those given parameters. So it's just more information to help dictate and help to optimize how we're actually delivering those images. But now we can see when we're loading those smaller images on smaller devices, we can have such a big impact on the size of the image that we're actually delivering. So now that we're optimizing the way that we're actually delivering these images to make them as performant as possible, now let's actually start to get images into our library. So let's add uploading. Now, as I alluded to earlier, we're going to use the upload widget in order to easily add uploading into our application. And we can see here we have an option of 2 different components. We have the upload button and we have the upload widget. Now, the difference between the two is the upload button is just a wrapper around the upload widget, where it's just going to render a button with very simple controls, where the upload widget will give you a lot more flexibility for how you render and control the experience. Now, for our purposes, we just need the upload button, so we're going to roll with that, where we can see the code to actually add it is pretty simple. And we can see that once we have that button, we get this really nice widget that gives us a lot of different options for how we upload our image and how we can control that experience. So we're going to get started by adding the upload button. Now looking at our app, the place I'm going to add this to is our navigation, where we can see here I have this link, which is just a placeholder, but we're going to add our upload button there. So it says upload, it has a nice little icon, and anytime somebody sees that, they can easily click it to upload their new files. So back inside of my code, I'm going to head over to components, and I'm going to open up my nav bar where we can see I have that link already available. Now, one caveat with using the upload button or the upload widget is it's a client component. And at the time of recording this, it requires you to use the use client directive because it's not currently bundled inside of the component. So we can see here in this warning, if we're using the app router, if you're using the pages router, it doesn't matter. But our example here is the app router. So we need to make sure we add our use client. Now, rather than opting in my entire navigation into a client component, I'm going to go ahead and create a new component that's going to wrap that button. So I'm going to call it uploadButton.tsx. And if we notice here, I'm using a different pattern for how I'm managing this component, just out of simplicity for this demo. So I have this top level file under components, but I'm going to call it constant upload button is equal to my component function. I'm going to ultimately return something, but at the bottom, I'm going to export my default upload button. Now, importantly, let's import our CLD upload button from Next.js. I need to also make sure I opt this into a client component, but then let's actually render out our component just to get started. Now, back inside the navigation, I can now import my upload button component. I'm going to go ahead and replace my link with that upload button. And just to kind of explain something here, our navigation is a server component, but because it's a server component, I can't do client component like things such as use effect, use state, or anything that's required inside of the client inside of this particular component. But what I can do is I can render client components inside where once that branch of the component opts into the client, I can do whatever I want inside the client inside of this particular component. But now when we head back over to the browser, we can already see that this changed from link to upload. And let's give it a quick try. If I click it, we can already see that we have our upload widget, and literally that's all we did. We didn't really need to do much. Now, if we try to upload something, it's not going to quite work yet because we have to do one of two things. Now, when you're uploading to Cloudinary, you have two options. You either have unsigned uploads or you have signed. Unsigned uploads is basically saying you're allowing anybody to upload as long as they pass in a particular upload preset or basically a default configuration for those uploads. Now, we want to go the more secure route, so we're going to use signed uploads, which means every time we make an upload request, we're going to use our API credentials, our key and secret, to sign that request when it's getting uploaded, just to make sure that we have control over what's actually getting uploaded to our account. Now, heading back to the documentation for a second, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new API endpoint where anytime that the upload process occurs, it's going to first grab that signature from the endpoint and then pass it along through the upload process. Now, to find an easy to reference example of this, we can head over to the upload widget section where we can see signed uploads, where here we're going to be able to find an endpoint that we can simply copy and paste into our project. Now, we can see that we need to install Cloudinary, which we did. We need to set up our credentials, which we did, where all we need to do is we need to define that signature endpoint as a prop on our upload button, and then we just simply need to create this new API route. So now let's start off by creating this sign Cloudinary parameters route. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy that because we're just going to create it as it says in this documentation. I'm going to head back to my code, and under app, I'm going to create a new folder called API. Inside API, a new folder called Cloudinary, sign Cloudinary params, and I'm going to create my route.ts file inside of that. Now back to the documentation, I'm going to, again, just simply copy and paste this code because it has everything I need, including using the Node SDK in order to sign that request. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that into my project. I'm going to go ahead and trim that white space. I need to fix that. But we can see all we need to do now is define that signature endpoint. So inside of my upload button code, I'm going to define signature endpoint, and I'm going to specify it as my /API, hide myself, /API sign Cloudinary params. But now heading back into the project, let's go ahead and click upload again. I'm going to now browse for a file. Let's go ahead and add this picture of Brazil. We can see that it's successfully uploaded, and I now have that photo. I'm going to go ahead and click done, but we can't see it actually on our page. And that's because we're not currently refreshing the page once we have a successful upload. Now let's double check that it did upload though. So I'm going to head over to my console. And if I refresh the page here, we can see that the image does now show up. So I did successfully upload it. Now, before we move on of figuring out how we actually refresh the page, I want to do one thing, and I like to have a little icon along with my upload button just to give a quick visual representation of what it is. It makes it a little bit easier to find as well. In order to support icons in the project, I'm currently using Lucid React. And we can see I'm currently using the image icon in order to show the photos option inside of the sidebar, which if we looked at the left-hand side of the template, we can see it readily available there. Lucid React is really easy to install if you don't have it yet inside of your project, so you can go ahead and configure it there. If you're following along with the template, it should already be ready to go. But once we're there, we can head over to the icons page where we can search for and find the different icons we want. So I'm going to go ahead and just search for upload, for instance, and we can see we have a bunch of examples. Now, the one that I want to use, I'm going to simply import upload from Lucid React. And now we can actually break down our upload button components just to make it a little bit easier to navigate around. I'm going to close tag that. But then inside, what we can do is anything you pass as a child into the upload button, it's going to render inside of the actual button itself. So I'm going to add my upload icon and then the upload text back inside. Now, if we look back at the project, we can see that, well, it worked, but not quite as we expect. So let's add some styles. Now, first of all, I want to resize that icon a little bit. So I'm going to add class name and specify width of 4, height of 4. And we can see I'm using Tailwind for my sizes. It's already configured in that template. You can use your own styling solution depending on what you want to use. But I also want to be able to put those icons and the label on the same line and then center them vertically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap it in a span. I'm going to close that tag. And then on the span, I'm going to first define flex to use flexbox. I'm going to add a gap of 2, and then I'm going to say items center. And I'm going to hide myself just to make sure that you can see this and I'm not covering myself up. So we have flex, a gap of 2 to add space between the icon and the label, and we're going to align them center. And as we can see, that's looking a lot better. We have our icon and it still works just as expected. Now, another thing that I want to do is when we upload, if I select the file again and select upload, we can see that the UI just kind of sits there. I have to manually select done, which again, let me hide myself. We can see this orange button. I have to manually hit done in order to close that. So what kind of options do we have to get that out of the way so it's not intrusive on the UI once it finishes uploading? Now, in addition to the signature endpoint, we can define some other options on our upload button. So I'm going to specify an options prop, and on this, I'm going to say auto minimize and set that to true. So now when I try to use the upload widget again and select a new file, we can see that it automatically goes down. I'm going to hide myself again. It automatically goes to the bottom right of the page. And you can also configure the location of that, but I'm pretty happy with the default of it being there. We can even open it back up if we want, and we can even upload more, but we can see that it collapses down to the bottom right of the page by default. Now, moving on to how we're going to actually refresh this data on the page, in the world of server components and client components, we need to consider how they're going to communicate with each other. And there's not a lot of great options, or at least not complicated options for how we can refresh that particular server component from the client. But what we can do is we can render that initial data as we're doing now. We're going to pass that to the client, and then we can use a different solution to take over. And in particular, we can use Tanstack Query, where what we'll do is we'll take that initial data, we'll pass it to Tanstack Query, and then any subsequent request, or when we're finished uploading something, we're going to add that data to the Tanstack Query data store. Now, if you want to learn more about Tanstack Query or previously React Query, you can head over to the documentation, but we're going to go ahead and just dive in and get started and work through the example. So we can see we can get started by installing Tanstack/React Query. So inside of my terminal, I'm going to npm install Tanstack React Query. Now, once that's finished installing, I'm going to head back to my code. And now we need to think about how we're going to approach this, where we have two aspects of how we're going to use query, where the first one is actually the use query hook itself, which is going to allow us to make that fetch and manage the state of that. But what we need to do is also install what's called a provider around our application so that we can have access to that state anywhere inside of the tree underneath that provider. Now, to do that, we're going to head over to our layout component. Where here, if we install the provider at the layout, that's going to give the opportunity for any component in the tree of our application to have access to that query provider. Now, the tricky thing is, because we're dealing with server components and client components, this is currently a server component and query needs to run on the client. But what we can do is we can use what's called the donut pattern, where essentially we're going to add a client component on our page, but as child, we're going to still pass through those server components, so it can act like nothing happened as we're passing the server components basically through that donut of a client component, which is going to be our provider. Now I'm pretty much going to follow along with the Tanstack Query documentation here, where under advanced server rendering, we can find server components and Next.js app router, where if we scroll down a little bit, we can see that it recommends to create a new file called appproviders.jsx, where we'll ultimately copy and paste this code in, where we're going to create that provider, which will later import into our layout. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this, and we'll go over it in a second. But back inside the code under my app directory, I'm going to create that providers.tsx file, and I'm going to paste that in as is. Now I'm going to hide myself. Immediately we see a TypeScript issue, so I'm going to go ahead and type that out as children React Node, and we want to make sure we update that import. A little quick trick is hitting Command period when you have that selected, so that I can hit update import from React. And all that really did was at the top, we can see we're now importing it from our React package. But going through the rest, I'm not going to go through this too granularly, but we can see that we're importing our query client and the query client provider. And really, we're just using some optimized settings for making it work between the server and the client rendering lifecycle. So we're going to just kind of skip through that part. If you want to look more at the documentation, I would encourage you to read through that server-side rendering page inside the documentation. But ultimately, we're exporting these providers, and now we want to bring it in and actually wrap it inside of our layout. So if we head back to that documentation page, we can scroll down where we see that we're going to want to now import that providers file, and we're going to simply just wrap our children with it inside of our layout. So inside a layout, I'm going to go ahead and paste in that providers, and like I said, we're going to go ahead and wrap our children with it. And now that we have that all set up, we can actually start making our queries inside of our project. So we're going to head back over to our media gallery, which is where we're going to actually request that data. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import use query from at Tanstack. I'm going to hide myself here, React query. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and scroll down into my component, where I'm going to now set up a use query instance, where I'm going to pass in an object for my configuration, where the first thing I want to do is I want to set up a query key. And for that, let's call it resources. It's going to be an array where we pass in these query keys. And then we're going to want to set up a query function, which is going to be the actual fetcher for what we're going to request. So let's set up that function. It's actually going to be async. And here's where we hit a little bit of a hitch, where we actually need to be able to request these resources somehow. And again, we're inside the client of this application, so it's not like we have direct access to use the Node SDK here. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an API endpoint where we can request those resources using this fetch request. So I'm going to head back over to my sidebar, where I'm going to, under my API directory, I'm going to create a new folder called resources. And inside, I'm going to create a new file called route.ts, where here I'm going to export an async function called get, because ultimately we're going to make a get request, where now I can start to import the Cloudinary SDK to make it easier to get those actual resources. So we already created that signed Cloudinary params file. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy the snippet from the top of that. And I'm going to go ahead and paste it right at the top, where now that we have Cloudinary imported, I can now destructure resources, since we know what it looks like from the page earlier. I'm going to hide myself, where we're going to await cloudinary.api.resources. And once we have those resources, I can now return the response object .json method, where I'm going to pass in my data as my resources. But now back inside of our query function, I can start to query for that actual data. So I'm going to say await fetch, where I'm going to hit the API resources endpoint. Let me hide myself again. I'm going to turn that into then our JSON, where I'm going to destructure my data from that. And then ultimately, I want to return that data. But now that we have that use query set up, we know that use query is going to actually return some data for us, along with a lot of other things like the status of that request. So I'm going to destructure my data from use query, and let's console log that out just to see what that looks like. If we head back to the browser, and let me hide myself here, we can see that our data is being logged out. And we can see that we currently have 10 resources, which matches what we have inside of the actual gallery page. But we can see for each of these, we have all the information that correlates to a Cloudinary resource. So we were able to just make that request on the client. But one thing that we have here is notice that the data is first undefined, but we're already querying that from the server. So how can we actually pass that initial data through from the server to the client so that we have what we already have available? Now back inside of the code, our useQuery hook is also going to take a property called initial data, where we already are grabbing those resources from the server. So why can't we just pass those right along through? And that's exactly what we're going to do, where I'm going to take these resources and I can actually just rename this as initial resources. And I'm going to set this initial data property as my initial resources. But then just to make it a little bit easier on myself, I can rename data to resources. And now let's console log out that resource to see what it looks like. And once we reload the page, we can immediately see that we now only have that one resources log that includes all that data because it's using that initial data and passing it through to the query client. Now this is working really well for being able to manage that lifecycle between the server and the client. But we have one problem here. We want to be able to add new resources to that state so that whenever we upload an image from that upload button, we're able to push it into that state. But before we even get to that point, one additional issue is we don't have access to that navbar button directly inside the media gallery. So what we're going to first do is we're going to take this useQuery instance, we're going to put it into our own hook instance, and we're going to be able to share that hook between the media gallery and then the navigation. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new directory inside of my source called hooks. And inside of hooks, I'm going to create use resources.ts. Now inside of here, I'm going to export a function called use resources, where the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to basically just copy everything and paste it into here. So let's go back to the media gallery where I'm going to grab, first of all, the import for useQuery, and let's paste that in the top. I'm going to grab the actual query information itself. Let's keep that console log in there just so that we can test it out as we're working through this. We need to make sure we have that instance of the initial resources. So what we're going to do is we're going to allow instances of use resources to actually pass in options. And inside those options, we're going to take those initial resources. So I'm going to first define that argument of options, and let's name this a new interface of use resources. And I'm going to set up my options to reference that. Now here, we're going to want to grab those initial resources, which is going to be an array, and we need to define that type. If you remember before, we already created a Cloudinary resource. So first let's grab that and let's abstract that so we can import that in both places. If you remember, we actually created that Cloudinary resource at the top of Media Gallery, the same place that we were using it before. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this out of this particular file. And again, inside of my source directory, I'm going to create a new folder called types. Inside of types, I'm going to create a cloudinary.ts file where I'm going to simply paste in that Cloudinary resource, where I'm going to export that interface of Cloudinary resource. So if you're following along, we grabbed the media gallery Cloudinary resource, which we had previously created, and we're creating a new file that contains that so that we can share it between the different files. So now let's head back to media gallery where we can resolve that type issue now. And I could import my Cloudinary resource that I just created from at types Cloudinary. We can see that that Cloudinary resource should be now resolved. So now let's also bring that into our use resources hook. So I'm going to go over to use resources. I'm going to paste that in as well. And now, because I can share it between the two files, I can say that my initial resources is going to be an array of those Cloudinary resources. So now let's continue wiring this up so that it works as we expect it to. Now, first of all, our initial resources, of course, that's now going to come from our options. So let's add options and let's optional chain that just in case it's not being passed in. And we can make sure that we're now going to return our resources. So I'm going to go ahead and return a new object. I'm going to return those resources as is. But now we have our basic hook configured where we can start to actually use it inside of our project. So I'm going to head back over to Media Gallery, where now let's import our use resources hook. Make sure I have a capital R from at hooks, use resources. And then at the top of my file, I can say constant resources, which I'm going to destructure from use resources. And of course, we want to make sure that we pass in our initial resources right through to that hook. But now just to make sure that everything is still working as we expect it to, I'm going to go ahead and console log out our resources. And if we refresh the page, we can see that it's still working exactly as expected. So now let's start to add that mutation angle. So Tanstack Query comes with the concept of mutation, where we can wrap a request similar to what we did with the use query hook, only it's meant for changing data. Now, the problem with that, though, is we don't really need it because all the uploading happens automatically for us from within this widget. So how can we still tap into that life cycle where we can push the resources into state and also maybe invalidate it so that it'll then refresh and get the most fresh content directly from the server? So we're going to take advantage of something called the query client, which is going to give us the ability to both set and invalidate our data, where specifically, once we import this, we'll now have access to do something such as set query data, where it's going to allow us to set the updated data by using the cache keys. And then we're going to also use invalidate queries, where we can pass in the queries that we want to invalidate, and specifically the ones related to the upload we just made. So starting off, back inside our use resources hook, I'm going to import the use query client hook, where we're going to set that up at the top of our use resources hook, where I'm going to say constant query client is equal to use query client. So now I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to create a new function, and I'm going to call that add resources. And this function is going to be what I use to pass the resources to eventually set that into the query data. So I'm going to take that add resources, I'm going to return it from my hook, where then inside of the upload button, I want to now get that function from the hook. So I'm going to import my use resources from @hooks use resources. Let me hide myself to make sure I'm not covering anything up. And then I'm going to destructure that add resources from my use resources hook. Now, one thing that we immediately see is we're going to get a TypeScript error on that. And if we head back to our use resources hook and scroll up to the top, one thing that we never did is we never made options actually optional. So the first thing we're going to do is make that optional. And then similarly on initial resources, I'll also make that optional as well, because we don't need to necessarily pass in the initial resources if we don't have them. Now, going back to the upload button, now that we have this add resources function, I ultimately want to trigger that anytime we have a successful upload. Now, fortunately, on the CldUpload button, as well as some other events, we have on success. So I'm going to add an on success callback, if I spell that right, and I'm going to set that as handle on success, where now I can start to define that handle on success function, where this is ultimately going to receive results. Where in order to type this out, we currently have to import that from the Next.js package. So I'm going to go up to my Next.js import. I'm going to hide myself just to make sure this is all clear. And I'm going to import Cloudinary upload widget results. And then I'm going to go ahead and set the type for my actual results. And let's just log this out for a second, just to kind of see what's going on. If we head back to the page and refresh and we try to actually upload something, let me select my file and upload it. We can see that we get that results event, where we can see it's a success, and then we get our info, where that info is essentially going to be the resource that we have. It's going to include all the information we need. It includes a little extra information related to the upload widget success, where we can see like the batch ID, for instance. But ultimately, this is going to be the info that we're going to use in order to push it into our state. So let's do just that, where the results.info is going to be what we need. So what we can do is on add resources, we can push that directly through. And we're going to accept that as an array so that in the future, we can always push in multiple resources if we want to. And especially just makes it a little bit easier because we know that our state is an array of resources anyway. So I'm going to pass this in as results.info. And we can see that we still get a TypeScript error because we need to cast this as a Cloudinary resource. So I'm going to go ahead and import Cloudinary resource from, I'm going to hide myself, @types Cloudinary, where I'm going to go ahead and cast that as Cloudinary resource. And we're still getting a type error, but let's head over to our actual add resources function, where we never actually set that up to receive the results. So first, let's add that argument of results. And we know that we need to set the type of this as well, where we're going to receive, again, that array of Cloudinary resources. So now let's again take a quick checkpoint just to make sure that this is working. So let's console log out our results from add resources. I'm going to add resources in the front of that just to make sure we know which one we're looking at. And I'm going to go ahead and clean that up from the handle on success function itself. But again, I refresh and I'm going to upload yet another image. And we can see once it's uploaded, we do get that add resources results, and I can expand it and we can see all the information related to it. So now that we're successfully passing it into the hook, let's now use that data to actually add it into the state so that eventually we want to refresh it on the page. Now, looking back at the setQueryData method, we want to be able to pass in two arguments. First, we have the query key, which is similar to what we were doing with the useQuery hook as well. But then we have an updater, which is going to be a function where we're going to take our old data and merge it with our new data. So now back inside the code, I'm going to take advantage of that query client where I'm going to say query client.set query data, where the first thing we need to do again is add those tags. And we can see, similar to query data up here, I'm going to just simply copy that same query key, and I'm going to hide myself as we're adding this. But then we have the second thing, which is going to be that updater. So that's going to be a function where the argument is going to be old, where we have that old data that we want to add, and then we want to merge it with new. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to return a new array where I'm going to spread out my old data, but I'm also going to take the results and I'm going to spread that out before. Now, yet again, the query system doesn't know what kind of data I'm passing through, so I'm going to go ahead and type out this old data so that I can add it as a Cloudinary resource, and we can see it makes it happy. And if we go back to upload button, we can see that we're passing through that data, and we come back to the add function, the add resources function, where it's going to set that query data based on that same query key, where then it's going to again merge the old data with the new one. And since we want to have it appear at the top of the list in chronological order, it's going to put it in the front of that array. So now let's try that out. I'm going to go ahead and upload a new image. I'm going to select it. Let's go with this bottom one, where we can see after it's uploaded, we can now see it immediately appear inside of the actual UI. Now, this all works fine and well, but it's technically not a representation of the server because we didn't actually request this resources list from the server. We pushed it in based off an assumption that it was successfully added. Now, theoretically, it should be completely fine, but just to make sure that we are getting the completely fresh data, that there wasn't an error somewhere, we can now invalidate that query. So it then goes and tries to make a fetch request to get the real content from the server. And if there's any changes, we'll have that reflected again in the UI. So back inside of the code, I'm going to again use the query client, but this time I'm going to use invalidate queries, where this invalidate queries is going to take an object where we can pass in a query key. And similarly, that's going to be our resources. Now this time, instead of just watching the console log, I'm going to open up the network tab where I'm going to go ahead and trigger a new upload just as we usually do. And we can see after it was successfully uploaded, it did add it, but we have another request now in the network tab where we now have that resources request that's immediately going to happen after we push it in the UI because we invalidated that query. We can see we have a preview and a response of all the data that came back. So we know for a fact that the image is now available in our resources list. Now, just as a quick note, this pattern is called optimistic UI or optimistic updates, where as soon as we have that information, we're going to push it into the UI and then later validate it. Now, it's technically a little bit different the way that we're doing it because we're doing it on successful upload, but maybe you have a list of to-dos where you have that text and you can immediately push it in. Or maybe what we're not going to actually cover is here. Maybe you can grab that local file, push that into the UI immediately, and then later validate it on the server. But either way, it's a good pattern to make the UI feel responsive as you're doing that upload. But we can see that if you are using the mutation function inside of a future request, you can actually just control this using their recommendation by finding the optimistic updates page inside of the Tanstack Query documentation. Now moving on, I went ahead and deleted some of the images that I uploaded because I want to show the next issue where we can see that we're currently showing all the images in the account, including all those sample images that come with the account. Now, those are great for being able to test things out, but we only want to show the images that were actually intentionally uploaded into our photo library. So we're currently using the resources method, where if we head back inside of our code, where we can either look at the API resources route, or we can look at the page where we're querying that, we can see that we're using that resources method from the Cloudinary API. Now, this is, again, working really well for our current use case just to get the data on the page, but now we can start to narrow down how we're going to query that. And we can do that by using tags, where what we're going to do is we're going to first tag every single upload that we make from this page, and then we're going to only query for resources that match that tag. So starting off inside of the upload button, let's first tag every single upload that we make from this account. So I'm going to go ahead and inside of my options on the CldUpload button, I'm going to add a new property of tags. I'm going to add an array where I'm going to simply add media. That's just a pretty generic word, and that's tags. That's just a pretty generic word to represent any kind of image or video that I upload. And right now we're currently focusing on images, but it still is a good representation. You can really name that anything you want. You can name it photo box, like you can see in that demo that I mentioned earlier, or really anything that's just going to basically represent your images inside of your library. But now let's actually upload something. So I'm going to go ahead and click upload. I'm going to select my file, and how about this nice picture of Greece, where we can see once it's uploaded, I'm going to go over to the network tab, and let's go look at this upload request, where we can see under tags, we have media. So now if we head over to our media library, I'm going to refresh the page. We can see our new picture. And if I go over to my metadata, we can see that it has that new tag of media. So now let's try to only pull in the images from our account that matches that tag. So back inside of my code, I'm going to start off with the page for the server request, and then we're going to move on to that API route. We're under the pages, app pages page, where I'm making that initial request. Instead of the API resources, I'm going to do resources by tag, where I'm going to go ahead and paste or add in that media tag. And just to make sure that we can clearly see that, we see that resources by tag, and I'm passing in that string of media. Now, because we know that that's going to refresh inside the client, let's head back over to that API route. We're under app API resources route. We're going to update that as well to resources by tag. And I'm going to additionally pass in media. But now if we go back to the application and refresh, we should see that we only have that one image displaying because it's the only image in our account that's actually matching that tag. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and clean up my media library a little bit. I'm just going to go ahead and delete the images that I uploaded that don't match that tag. And I'm just going to leave those samples in there as well. It's really up to you for how you want to manage your own media library. And it looks like I got a little aggressive there and I deleted the Greece one too, but we can know that we can simply upload a new file, such as this picture of Brazil. And we can see once it's uploaded, it's going to be immediately added to the UI. Now it's time for a little bit of an optimization, where as we were adding this hook to our navigation for that upload button, we started to create a little bit of an issue where, because we're first defining our initial resources as undefined, it's getting rendered that way. And if we look and refresh the page, we see that we don't get the image as fast as we were before. And we also see immediately from the media gallery that we're console logging out that undefined resources first. So how can we address that? Now, going back to the code, I'm going to approach this by two angles. The first one being, if we're adding this hook inside of our navigation, I don't want to even make any kind of fetch to begin with. So the first thing we can do is the use query hook has a property called enabled, which we can set dynamically based off of where we're actually adding this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new property of disable fetch, which is optional, which is going to be a Boolean. And then I'm going to start to destructure that, disable fetch from my options, which, because options is optional, I'm going to go ahead and default that to an object, but we're going to then take disable fetch. I'm going to by default make that false because we're going to default into it fetching. I'm going to hide myself so that you can see this, but now we're going to take disable fetch and we're going to say we're only going to want this enabled if we don't have disable fetch set to true. Now heading over to our upload button, we can simply add this onto our use resources hook by adding a new object. And I'm going to add disable fetch, and I'm going to set that to true. Now back inside the app, if I try to refresh the page, we're still seeing that resources is undefined first. Now the other approach we can take is, because we know that we can set a query key dynamically, I can pass in the tag of the query that I want to make, where inside a media gallery, we want to query that tag of media. And inside of upload button, we don't actually want to query anything. Now, because of the way that that works, we're only going to be working with the resources of a tag of media inside of the media gallery as we're requesting that specific tag. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new property called tag that's going to be a string, and it's going to be optional, of course, where inside of my query key, I'm going to say that I want this query key to be resources, and I also want to include my tag, which is going to be options tag. Now, additionally, I need to actually pass in this tag from media gallery. So inside of media gallery, where I have my use resources hook, I'm going to pass in a tag of media. Now, if I head back to the page and refresh, we can see that that image is showing much faster because we're getting that initial data from the server, and we also don't get that undefined resources. Now, the nice thing is we'll see that we'll later be using this tag in a dynamic way where we're going to have different pages that have different tags, but we'll come back to that later. But one optimization that we can immediately make to how we're setting this up is when we're using media gallery, we're already using a tag. If we head back over to our page under pages, page.tsx, where we're actually including that media gallery, if you remember, we're querying hide myself, we're querying the resources by tag and we're looking for media. So why not set that media tag once and then pass it through the media gallery so we know, depending on the media gallery instance that's being used, it's going to request the appropriate tag. So inside of my media gallery, the first thing I'm going to do is set up that new property of tag where it's going to be a string as well. I'm going to destructure it from my media gallery props, and then I'm going to pass that tag directly into the use resources hook. Now on that page, again, I can pass in my media tag as a prop to my media gallery. And heading to the browser, just to double check, it is working as expected. Now, personally, when I'm creating strings like this that have an actual meaning and representation throughout my application, I don't want to have to manage that tag every single place inside the application separately. So we can define that in a central location so that we can easily adjust that if we need to, if we ever want to change that tag, for instance, or maybe depending on the environment, or if you want to share this code, maybe other people want to use other tags like I did with PhotoBox. So we have one of two options where we can either define a constant inside of our project, or we can set up an environment variable, which is kind of a way I like to handle that. So inside of my .env.local file, I'm going to create a new environment variable, and we're just going to paste that in of next public Cloudinary library tag. And that's just supposed to be a generically meaning phrase in order to describe the actual tag that I'm using. So I'm going to set that as media, where now I can take that, head back to my application, and wherever I'm using media, such as this location, I can add my process.env, my next public Cloudinary library tag, where you can just shorten that to library tag, whatever you want to do. But because it's Cloudinary specific, that's why I'm using Cloudinary there. And then we can start to use that in the other locations, such as the API route. I'll go ahead and replace that tag, which is generically getting those resources for us. We can also do it inside of our page, where I'm getting the resources by tag for that home page, as well as the media gallery prop. Now that should cover all those instances, but one last time, let's double check. And it looks like we're working as expected. Now, one thing that we didn't cover, however, is we never thought about how this impacts our optimistic UI that we set up. So I'm going to click upload. I'm going to try to upload a new file. And we can see that we get an error. It says old is not iterable. Now the issue is inside of our use resources hook, we scroll down to where we set up our add resources. We set our query key for both the setting query data and invalidating to just the resources. We never updated that to our media to include our media tag. So it has no idea, and it's trying to just invalidate data or set data for something that it doesn't currently exist. So we want to also make sure that we update every instance where we include that new tag. So I'm going to go ahead and just break this down to make it a little bit easier for us to read a little bit, but then we can go ahead and add that same tag that we added in the other locations of my library tag. I'm going to grab that and I'm going to add it to my set query data method, as well as my invalidate queries method. But now let's test that out. And we can see that because I refreshed the page, the image is actually showing. But now let's try to use that optimistic UI, where as soon as I upload the file, we can see that it adds just as expected. Now, I think we're in a pretty good position with our media gallery, and we'll come back and we'll do some things later. But next, I want to make sure that I have an individual page for every single one of my images. So when I click through to this, I can actually view that specific image, and then eventually I can make those edits. Now, I pre-configured a page at resources/page, where we can see that it's currently similarly to what we started off with the gallery. It just loads a logo here currently, just as a placeholder, but we have some existing UI, including our editing, our info, and our delete that we can hook into as we start to add this capability. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this from a static page and we're going to make it a dynamic route, where then once this page loads, we're going to fetch that image and then use that information to populate the page. Now going back inside of our code to actually find this file, if we go under source app, we're not going to look under pages, we're going to look under the resources directory, where we have a layout for our resources, but then we have that page directory that includes our page. And we can see that it looks pretty similar to the same thing that we had for our media gallery, our homepage, where we're using the media viewer component now to give our interactive UI using a client component inside of the project, where this resource, this page, is going to be a server component where similarly, again, we're going to request that data using the Node SDK for that individual asset and then pass it along through. But the first thing we need to do is actually make this route dynamic so we can get that dynamic value. So what we're going to do is inside of the sidebar, we can see under the resources directory, we're going to rename this page directory, and we're going to set this to use brackets, and inside we're going to add a variable name, and I'm going to use asset ID. Now, why asset ID as opposed to something like public ID, where asset ID is going to be very unique. It's an easily queryable data value that we can use in order to do that. And it's just a little bit of an easier way for us to confidently query our data and pass that along through the application. But it's going to be a unique value that we can ultimately use to make the request using the API. But just back to the sidebar for a second, this resources asset ID, because we're adding this in brackets, we're basically telling Next.js that we want this to be a dynamic parameter value. We want this to be dynamically loaded based off of whatever somebody's going to in the browser. So that means inside of our resource function, which is our page component, we're going to receive an argument that's going to include params, which is where we're going to grab this value from. Now, let's type this out as we're going to receive our params, and we're going to ultimately get our asset ID value. And that's going to also be a string. But now we can say, let's console log out params just to kind of see what that's going to look like. Now, if I go back and refresh the page as is, just simply with that page inside, if I now look inside of my terminal, I can see that params console logged out with that asset ID where it's now equal to page. Now, if we go back quick to our gallery page where we're listing out our resources, I can just actually grab one of these asset IDs from any one of them that are getting currently listed out. I can go back to my resources page and I can replace page with that asset ID. Now, nothing too different should happen, but we should see that our params change from page to that asset ID. So that's showing that it is a dynamic value based off of whatever's inside of this URL. So now let's actually take that asset ID to actually change it. But before we do, let's make it a little easier so we don't have to manually grab that asset ID each time. Let's actually set up the links on our homepage so that whenever somebody clicks one of these, they're going to go to that link automatically. So back on the media gallery component, I already have my link component imported from Next.js, where if I scroll down to the bottom of the page where I'm adding that CLD image, I already have that link component set up and wrapping around the image. So all we really need to do at this point is update the href in order to have that dynamic value. So instead of this hashtag that I have in there, I'm going to add the template tags where we're going to say /resources, and that's going to be a dynamic value where we're going to add resource.asset ID. And just to make sure that you can see that, our link href that's wrapping our image on the gallery page is going to be /resources, and then we're going to use a dynamic value of our resource asset ID. So now inside the application, if I click through to Sao Paulo, we can see that it does go back to that resource page, but now I have that dynamic ID inside the URL and I didn't have to manually add that. But now let's actually query for our resource on our dynamic resources page. So if we remember from earlier, we configured our SDK on the homepage. I'm just going to simply copy and paste that code over rather than having to type it all out again. But now we can add our media viewer inside of the media gallery. I'm going to get rid of the sidebar for a second, but inside of our actual resource page function, I'm going to say constant results is equal to await Cloudinary.api, where we're going to use the resources by asset IDs method, and just pay attention to that resources with an S by asset IDs with an S, where we're going to go ahead and pass in our params.asset ID. Now we can see that TypeScript is yelling at us. We don't actually need to make this optional. We should make sure that that's always getting passed through, but we can also want to pay attention to this says resources by ID. So why are we passing in a string? Well, this method takes both a string and an array of strings out of convenience, just so that we have an option to use it however we need in order to get our assets. So in this instance, we're just going to be able to get our single asset. But now let's console log out our results. And another thing that I do want to note is, where is that params asset ID coming from? Just to kind of confirm here, that's where we set up the dynamic page route inside of our tree here, where that asset ID is going to correlate to that param. But now if we head back into the application and we reload that page, we should be able to hop back to our terminal where we now see all that resource data. We have our results that we're console logging out, where we're going to have that property of resources that includes our single resource. So like we did with our gallery, I'm going to destructure resources from this request. And because we know that we're only going to pass in a single resource, I'm going to pass through resources 0, which is going to grab the first item of the array if it exists. Now, again, similar to what happened when we were setting up our gallery, we have a TypeScript issue here, because if we go to Media Viewer and let me get rid of the sidebar, we can see that this resource that we're defining that ID, just like we did before. And this needs to actually be a public ID. So instead of just trying to fix this again, we do have that Cloudinary resource type that we can now import and just use that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import my Cloudinary resource from types Cloudinary, and then make sure I have that spelled correctly. I can use my Cloudinary resource without an S as that resource type. But as we can see, we're still getting a type error, and that's because we're just simply using that ID somewhere. So at the bottom here, we can see we have resource.id that I was able to just Command F, and I'm going to add public ID. Now, if we head back to the application and refresh the page, we really shouldn't notice too much different. We might notice the logo is a lot bigger, and that's because the resource that we're trying to query just has a bigger size to it. So it's trying to fill up the space that it has. But one thing we should notice is if we go over to this info panel or button here and we click it, it's going to update that panel. And that's where we can actually see that ID that we just updated to public ID. And this value is dynamically being pulled from that dynamic resource that we had. So now not only should we show the ID, let's actually show the image instead of this Cloudinary logo. So just like our image that we updated in the gallery, let's update this to CLD image. So the first thing I'm going to do is change that image tag to CLD image. I'm going to dynamically update that from Next.Cloudinary. And just to confirm that, we can see that we imported CLD image. I like to organize the external imports at the top. We imported CLD image from Next.Cloudinary. Now going back to that, we can see that it has everything we need, the width, height. Instead of the source, we need to pass in that Cloudinary public ID. So I'm going to change that to resource.public ID. And similar to before, this Cloudinary logo doesn't really make sense for our current purpose. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And technically, if we wanted to, we could probably pass in that public ID. So I'm just going to say image public ID, and that should suffice for at least having a dynamic value in there that represents what it is. But now if we head back and we refresh the page, we should see that we have our nice big image, and in this case, Sao Paulo. Now, if I head back and go to another image such as Athens, we can see that that image dynamically loads based off of the route that we're getting because we're requesting the resource for that specific asset. So now that we have the ability to actually display our images and navigate around to them dynamically, let's start actually having some fun with this and start to edit our images, where we can use transformations in order to apply different effects to our images. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, the transformation API is a good reference for all the different things that we can actually apply to our images. But specifically, because we're using CLD image, we can take a look at the Next.Cloudinary documentation to get a good look about how we can more easily kind of work with these different transformations. And just a quick note that there are options to be able to add any transformation if it's not directly supported by the CLD image component. And if not, just make sure you file an issue on the GitHub repo. But if we take a look at this, I'm going to hide myself. We can look through all the different options available. We have the sidebar that shows everything. There's some really interesting AI-oriented things like background removal, which we'll actually use. You can even change the color once you remove the background. There's generative fill, which we're not going to get into today, but it's pretty darn cool. You can also recolor, remove, replace, but some of the simpler effects are things like being able to blur an image, being able to turn it to grayscale, and all those different kinds of things, changing the different colors, having fun with some overlays. And there's just a ton of different things that you can do in order to really take advantage of the different effects and transformations from Cloudinary. So looking at the photo page, we're going to work on this edit tab where if we open it up, we can see that we get this panel that includes all these different tabs, including these enhancements, the cropping and resizing, and these filters that we can add. And we're going to work through all of these, but we're going to start off with the enhancements tab. Now inside of the code, we're going to be working out of the media viewer file, of course, where if we start to scroll down, we're going to scroll down until we get to this edit panel section. And I even have it clearly labeled to make it easier to find. But we have a sheet here, which is going to represent that panel UI that we have that we grabbed from shadcn. But if we start to scroll down, we're going to look for the enhancements section specifically, where we have this unordered list that currently just has this none option. So we're going to start to expand the options that we have available here. So to start, I'm just going to duplicate this list item. I'm going to start off with, how about improve? I'm going to add another one of restore, and then I'm going to add yet another one of remove background. Now, if we refresh the page and reopen the panel, we can see that it was updated with all of our different options. But now let's try to get this set up so that we can actually store whatever enhancement we want to use in state so that we can then use it inside of the UI. To do that, we're going to use the use state hook, and we're going to create a simple instance that we're just going to call enhancement, and we're going to create a new one for each of the different types of editing that we're going to do, but it's just going to allow us to store what kind of enhancement we actually want to apply to the image. So I'm going to start setting up the state underneath my deletion state, which includes a few different things that we'll get into a little bit later, but I'm going to set that up with constant enhancement, set enhancement, and we're going to set that equal to use state. And we're going to make that just a simple string. Now, if we start to scroll down back to our page where we set up those enhancement values, where we have our none, we have our improve, and we have our restore and remove background, what we're going to do is whenever somebody clicks one of these buttons, we want to store that enhancement in our state. So to get started, I'm going to just break down these buttons a little bit, where I went ahead and just did that off camera just to save a little time. But here I'm going to add on click, where I'm going to say whenever that is clicked, I'm going to set enhancement, where for this one, I'm going to simply call it improve, where now we can replicate that through all of our other ones. We have our none, which I'm just going to set that to undefined. Then we're going to scroll down to our restore. Let's call that one restore. Our remove background, which I'm going to call that simply remove background. And now just to make sure that we're on the right track and just do a little quick confirmation here, I'm going to console log out my enhancement. And if I refresh the page, open up the edit panel, and I start to click these items, we can see that it is logging out that state. Now, heading back over to the documentation for a second, let's see how this is actually going to get applied to our image. Where if we start to look at these transformations, let's start with restore, where we can see that in order to add restore, we just simply need to add the prop of restore. We don't even need to add a true to that. That's going to automatically resolve as true and opt us in, where this restore one in particular, it's going to take a blurry image and it's going to, or blurry or poor quality image, and it's going to restore its quality. So if we look inside of our media viewer, what we're going to want to do is we're going to store those transformations that we want to apply to the image in a temporary state so that we can simply spread them out on our CLD image appropriately for the different props and options that we want to use. So for instance, we can use transformations, which we can add as a constant at the top of the page, where I'm going to scroll back up there. I'm going to create those const transformations and set that equal to an empty object to start, where because we know that these are all going to be props that we're going to be passing into the CLD image component, we kind of already know what this type is going to be. So what we can do is we can actually just type out our transformations as our CLD image props. So scrolling back up to our import of CLD image, I'm going to import CLD image props, and I'm going to scroll down back to our transformations. I'm going to just create a new type for this called transformations, just to make it a little bit easier to read, where we're going to set that equal to CLD image props. But what we're actually going to do is CLD image props also expects a source value and an alt value because we're creating an image tag. So we're just going to emit those two props and then allow the rest to be passed in. So I'm going to use omit CLD image props, where then I'm going to pass in source and my alt. But now I can define my type on the constant transformations. And starting with my enhancement, I'm going to say if enhancement equals restore, all I'm going to do is I'm going to add transformations.restore and set that equal to true. Now, because we're not applying it directly to the React component, we do actually have to define that as a Boolean, otherwise that'll just be undefined. But we are setting that restore property to our transformations, which will be spread out onto that component. Now, heading into the browser, we're going to go ahead and now click on restore. And when you first click this, it's going to take a little while the first time to actually run this because we have to process that with AI in the background. But in my case, I already clicked it and I already loaded it. And we can see that by, if I actually open this up in a new tab, I can see eGen restore in the URL. Now, this looks pretty similar to the other one. Let me duplicate this tab just to make it a little bit closer to see if I remove this. And it didn't really do too much to this image. And I mean, honestly, this image is pretty great to begin with, so it didn't really have much to improve on. So let's actually take this image, let's create a blurry image out of this and test it on that. And again, if we go back to where we were talking about how we were using transformation URL parameters, we can really easily do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is, instead of width 3840, I'm going to simply change this to 500. So now we have a 500 pixel image, and then I'm going to add C scale, and I'm going to add W1000 to scale that up to 1000. And we can see that that's a pretty blurry version of this image. But now let's actually save this image and re-upload it to our media library so that we can try it out with this image. And I'm going to go ahead and save that to my desktop. Now, if we notice here quickly, we are getting a WebP format. And if we remember from earlier, we have this fauto in the URL, and that stands for format of auto. So it's going to automatically deliver the most efficient format for that browser and for that image. And in this case, we're getting WebP. Now, because we're uploading to Cloudinary, it knows what WebP files are. So I'm just going to go ahead and save this one as is. And then if we head back over to our application again, I'm going to go ahead and go to the upload page. I'm going to add my new file if I can find it inside of here. I think I just need to refresh that UI since it was pretty new. So I'm going to go ahead and select that file. We can see that it was uploaded, and we have our blurry image. So now let's actually try out this restore. So I'm going to open back up that edit panel, and I'm going to click restore. And again, you might have to wait a second. Well, that was actually pretty fast. And I don't know if you noticed, but that was a pretty big difference. Let's open that up in a new tab for this one as well. So this is going to be the restored image. We can see eGen restore here. Let me duplicate this tab and get rid of the original one. And let's go back and forth. We can see that that's a pretty substantial difference. That's a lot better than that blurry image that we had. And going back to the UI, we can actually go back and forth between none and restore, none and restore, and we can see that we can immediately get that now that it's completely loaded. So now let's wire up these other ones where we have improve and we have remove background. Now we already set up restore, but how about let's set up improve? Now for this one, we don't actually have an example like we did on the examples page, but what we're going to do is we're going to go down to filters and effects, and we're going to scroll down until we see, there it is, improve, where for this one, we can pass it in as a Boolean just like we did before. Now, if you want, you can also take that further. You can pass in a string with some different settings, or probably a number here. But what we can do is we can just use the improve similar to what we did with restore. So I'm going to just copy this because it's basically going to be the same thing. I'm going to say else if enhancement equals improve. I'm going to add that improve. And now if we click improve, we can see that the colors look a lot more interesting than they did without it. But now let's actually get off this blurry image and head back to a normal one where we can see that we have this nice original, and let's add it to that where we can add improve. And again, it's going to take a few seconds just to process that transformation. But once it does, we can still see that same effect, that it looks a lot more vibrant and a lot more interesting than it did on the original. And again, you can pass in custom settings to kind of tune that up how you want, but generally speaking, it gives a broad automatic improvement to the image. But now for the last one for our enhancements is remove background. And similarly, we're going to do the same thing. If enhancement equals remove background, we're going to set the property, but this time it's going to be remove background camel case. So now let's try to swap to that. And we can see that we immediately lose the image, but let me open up my web console. Looks like we get a nice 420 here, but let's actually inspect this. I'm going to refresh my tab and reproduce this so we can see what it looks like. And if I look at that image request, I'm going to scroll down. If I can expand this, I'm going to scroll down to XCLD error. Now, the nice thing is if you get a 400 level error, it's going to try to provide a descriptive reason inside of this XCLD error header. Now, for this particular case, we don't have an active subscription for the Cloudinary AI background removal. Now, background removal requires an add-on in order to make this work. But the good thing is there's a nice free tier so that we can just start testing it out. Now, just as a quick note, it is in the documentation specifying that you need the add-on. If you want to find a link to this, it's easily available under the remove background property, where we can go ahead and click through and we can learn more about the actual add-on. But heading over to our Cloudinary console, let's go over to the settings with this little cog here in the bottom left. We're here, if we scroll down on the left, we're going to find under Explore the add-ons page. We're here, we can immediately see at the top left that we have this Cloudinary AI background removal. Now, once we get to this page, we can see a little bit more information about the add-on. including the pricing tiers for this specific add-on, where here we get 15 free every month. So here we're going to want to go ahead and enable the free account. But now that we have this enabled, let's head back over to our app where I'm going to get rid of the web console. And now let's refresh the page and try this again, where I'm going to click remove background. And we can see that we still lose that image. But let's open on that web console again, where this time we're getting a 423 error. And that's a little bit different, where the way that the background removal works is it's first going to return a 423. And that 423 means it's processing in the background. So the subsequent requests, though, whenever that finishes, are going to deliver a standard request. So we can even see that the CLD image component pulls until that's available, where now we can see that it tried to remove the background. Now, I would imagine that's a little bit of a tricky one. There's a lot of detail in that, and it's not the most clean and crisp image to begin with, even though it's pretty nice. So let's try to use something that's a little bit easier to work with, where if I'm going to head back, I'm going to upload a new image. I'm going to go ahead and select one, and let's go through here. I have an elephant picture somewhere that I like. Here we go. We have our nice elephant friend. I'm going to try to upload that one. We're going to navigate over there. We can see that we have our image. I'm going to go ahead and try to remove background from this one. And we can see once it's done processing, this did a pretty good job. And we can toggle back and forth between the one with the background removed and with it not, and we can see just how well that it did. So imagine now, if we wanted to, we can go ahead and change that background. We're not going to add that kind of feature inside of this application, but just as an example, playing around with the URL parameters again, let's just add another transformation of B blue, which is just adding a blue background. And we can see how easy it was to add that background. We can even add images underneath that, or really whatever we want to transform it into something completely different. But I need to try to keep myself in the scope of what we're actually building inside this application. And now let's update the UI a little bit so that when we actually select something, it makes a clear indicator that we selected that one. And we can also update some icons to make it a little bit more representative of what we're trying to do. Now, looking back at the UI for a second, the way that we're currently showing these elements is I'm adding this border of white. Now, we can dynamically add that border so that any item that is selected only receives that white border. So let's start off with the undefined one, where let me first cut out this border white. I'm going to add a dynamic value where I'm going to say if enhancement doesn't exist, I'm going to add a ternary where I'm going to add the border of white because that is going to be our true value. And then otherwise, I'm going to add border of transparent. Now, looking at the app, we can see that the border actually disappeared from none, but that's because we have remove background selected, of course. So I'm going to go ahead and select none, and we can see that we get that border. And if we go off, we don't have it. So let's add that to the other ones. So I'm going to copy that ternary, and I'm going to scroll down first to improve. Let's replace our border white, where for this one, it's not going to just simply be if it doesn't exist. We're going to say if enhancement equals improve. Let's go ahead and copy this to the other ones. So I'm going to say for my restore one, if this is restore, and then scrolling down one more for remove background, we're going to say if this is remove background. We can already see that the UI updated. We're showing improve right now. If we go ahead and select off of it, it doesn't. We actually see a really nice difference there with the improve one, but that's kind of aside from the point. But we can see that depending on the one that we select, we have a nice UI indicator for it. So how about these icons though? For improve, I like the idea of just using this wand that we have at the top one. So I'm going to start there, where we can see inside of those tabs, I'm using wand 2 from Lucid React. Just to kind of show where I'm grabbing this from, if you remember from earlier, we installed Lucid React. Under icons, we have wand, and we have 2 different ones, and I'm going to use wand 2. So now for my improve option, I'm going to update that from ban to my wand 2. And let's just be honest here, I already know what icons that I want to look up, so I'm just going to look them up directly, but you can feel free to look through all these different ones. But for restore, I found this icon that I like, which is this pencil ruler, and I think that represents a good restore option. So for restore, I'm going to update that to pencil ruler, and I already know that name, so I'm going to add a quick import update to my Lucid React with that little shortcut as usual. I'm going to then go down to my background removal one, Where for background removal, I liked the idea of using scissors for this. And we can see we have a few good options for scissors here. Now, there was one that I actually liked a little bit more than this. If I type in hyphen here, we can see that I get this one with the dash lines on the bottom. And I liked that a little bit better. But for some reason, there's some searchability issues with this. And even the name of the imports didn't quite correlate with the names that we see on here. So I'm just going to skip that one. So I'm just going to use this square scissors one. We're inside of the app. That's going to be scissors square. I'm going to then be able to update that import by using the command period like we saw before, so that we can easily import that into the top of our project. But now heading back into our application, we can see all those lovely icons that have a lot better of a representation of what that specific option is trying to do. Now, one other thing that I want to do is, if we remember when we were selecting through the different options, sometimes it would just show the original for a second before we got the new one. Now, if we go back to one of the other images that we haven't touched yet, such as this train, and I open the panel, if I go ahead and hit something like restore, we can see that it's just showing the original image for a little bit. Now, I know that it's loading in the background, but what I wanted to happen is I want to show some kind of loading state. Now, the first thing I can do is, because this is a React component, I can set an updated key based off of the information that's inside of the project, so that I can refresh that once I have a new transformation. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to add key, and I'm going to set that equal to JSON.stringify, and I'm going to pass those transformations into that method. Now, just as a quick note, stringifying like that could potentially be expensive if you're trying to have a really performant UI. So we're really just using this as a kind of hack in order to force that component to refresh when we're changing the URL. But heading back inside of the UI, let me hide myself. We already tried restore, and I don't know if you can kind of see the difference there, that there's a very subtle difference, but it does look restored, but that's beyond the point. But if I try another one, we can see that we have it immediately go to black, and that's because it is updating to that new URL that just hasn't updated yet. So we can see that we're going to get the similar effect with remove background. Again, remove background works a little bit differently because of how it's processing, but it's still going to give that same similar experience. So let's actually try this on another image. So I'm going to hit back, and I'm going to go to the Sao Paulo example, since I don't think we have added the effects on here. And let's go ahead and try that on restore again. We can see that we immediately lose that image because it's now loading that new URL. And then as soon as that is loaded, it's going to pop back in, where now we can see that we have that restored version. Now, I think that's a better experience than what we had before, because it doesn't show a delay in the UI. So once you click on that button, it's immediately going to update, even though it's in a loading state. And to be honest, it looks a little broken because it's just pure black, right? That's the canvas in the background. That's not really indicating a loading state. Now, one of the nice things about the next image component, again, which CLD image wraps, is we can add some placeholders using SVG. So if we look at this guide that I have on the nextcloudinary.dev site, we can scroll down and we have a few options, including a blurred image, as well as being able to show a shimmer effect. Now, it's kind of hard to see if we're just looking at this here. Let me open up my network tab. I'm going to go ahead and throttle my connection so that we can actually see the loading indicator. I'm going to go ahead and hard refresh. And if we try to look down here, maybe I actually need to also keep my cache disabled. So let's try this out. If I hit hard refresh, we can see we get that blurred placeholder. If I scroll down, we can see that we get that shimmer effect. Let me try that again. We see we get that shimmer. So it just gives a little bit better of an effect for when it's loading inside of the application. So I'm going to go ahead and try out this shimmer effect. So I'm going to scroll down, and I actually have all this code really easy to copy and paste right inside of the documentation. So let's get started. For this one, we want to make sure we're in the correct router. I'm working in the app router, so I'm going to go ahead and copy this snippet. And when we're using this shimmer effect, we probably don't want to have to define this on every single instance of CLD image. So we're going to create a little simple wrapper around our CLD image component so that we can apply this shimmer to all of our different images. So opening up my sidebar under components, I'm going to create cldimage.tsx. And again, I'm using a similar pattern as upload button just because out of simplicity. But now let's go to hide that sidebar. Constant CLD image is equal to my new component function. And I'm going to export my default CLD image. Now, just so I don't lose this from my clipboard, I'm going to go ahead and paste all this shimmer code at the top of CLD image. But now we need to actually import CLD image so that we can render it inside of this component. So at the top, I'm going to import CLD image, but I'm going to import it as CLD image default from Next.Cloudinary because I don't want to have a name collision with the actual CLD image component that I'm defining there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, I'm going to add it as what's getting returned, and then I'm going to just simply spread the props out on that component. So I'm going to add my props, and because we need to type that, I'm going to get my CLD image props. I'm going to define that as my type for my props, and then simply spread this out on my CLD image default. Now, finally, we need to actually use this data URL. And if we head back to the documentation where we had this demo, we can see that the way that we're going to do this is we're going to simply set that data URL as our placeholder. So back in my code, I'm going to simply set my placeholder value to data URL. Now hold up, we have another type error here that we have to address, and I think it's because how we're creating this data URL that it just doesn't like it. But what I'm going to do is at the top of this file, I'm going to first import image props from next image, and then I'm going to scroll down and let me hide myself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say data URL as image props, and then I'm going to reference specifically the placeholder. But now, of course, we need to actually use this component. So I'm going to head back over to my media viewer. I'm going to go to the top of the page. I'm going to get rid of CLD image from Next.Cloudinary. And then I'm going to import as a new component my CLD image. Now heading back to the application to test this out, I'm going to upload a new file just so that we can actually see the loading experience for this. So how about we upload this one with some nice northern lights. I'm going to go ahead and go to that image. We can already see that we're getting that nice shimmer effect in the background there. But once it loads even further, we can go ahead and open that edit panel. And if I go ahead and click something like restore, we can see that we get this similar experience where we now have a nice loading indicator to show that that image is actually loading something in the background. But next, let's take this a step further and let's start to add some cropping and resizing. Now this is going to work really similar to the enhancements that we added, where we have this cropping and resizing section. We can see that we already have the original set up here, and now we're going to just add a few standard formats. Now the ones that I think make sense to add, I'm going to add square, I'm going to add landscape, and I'm going to add finally my portrait. Now, like before, I went ahead and just broke down these buttons just to make it a little easier to read as we're working through this. But I'm going to go ahead and add my click handler on click. And I'm going to say for this one, I'm going to create a new instance of state called crop, similar to what we did with the enhancements. So I'm going to say set crop, and I'm going to set that to undefined. But now let's actually set up that instance of state. I'm going to go back to the top of the file where we have our enhancement, and I'm going to just simply clone that to start. I'm going to make that set crop. I'm going to make sure I update that C. It's also going to be a string. But now I can update for the other ones. I'm going to have my square, set that to square. I'm going to have my landscape one, simply landscape. And then finally, my portrait, where because we already ran through one example of this, we kind of already know a little bit of what we're doing already. And in particular, we know we need to set those status indicators. So I'm going to go ahead and just set those now, where I'm going to copy this code from the enhancement, where remember, if we're setting the active value, we're going to set it of a border of white. Otherwise, we're going to have a transparent border, just to give a nice little indicator that it is active. So for each and every one of these, let me first just clone this for each one. I'm going to paste it in instead of border white at the end here. And then I can update my enhancements all to crop. And I'm going to say, first of all, for the top one, that needs to be if crop doesn't exist. For my next one, that's going to be if crop equals square. And then for my landscape one. And finally, for my portrait. Now back in my app, if I go ahead and try this out, we can see that that part is working. So now let's actually add the transformations. Now this is going to look pretty similar to what we did with enhancements, but it's going to include a little bit more math because when we're cropping and resizing, it's going to depend on the width and height for how we're going to actually handle this. So let's see what I mean here. Let's start off by saying if crop equals square. And if you think about when we get our width and height, if we have a width that is longer than a height, we probably want to use the height as the basis of the square, right? Where alternatively, if we have a height that is larger than our width, we would probably want to use the width to crop that down without having to try to upscale it or something along those lines. So let's first check that value. I'm going to say if resource.width is greater than resource.height. I'm going to say transformations.height is equal to resource.width. Otherwise, I'm going to do the opposite, and I'm going to say the width is equal to the height. Now, finally, because of the way that the image component actually crops on the URL, we kind of have two different ways of doing this, where one, along with the responsive sizing, we can crop everything after any transformations are applied. And more often than not, that's probably okay, but we want to actually crop the source of the image before any transformations are applied. That way we don't run into any wonkiness, including things like relative sizing that might change how the image is actually getting cropped. So what we're going to do is we're going to specify transformations.crop, where we're going to set that equal to, where we're going to first specify we want to crop it on the source by setting source equals true. And then I'm going to use a type of fill for that crop. But we can see that type error went away. It might have just been a little bit laggy with my IDE, but now let's actually check out this square transformation. Back inside of my app, if I go ahead and select square, we can see we get that nice loading state. And then eventually when it loads, we now have a square image where previously we had that nice tall image. Now, just to kind of pop in and see how this works on the URL parameters, just so we can kind of get that idea, we see that we have that crop of fill and we have that same value for the width and height, which of course gives us that square. The fill crop means that it's going to take up as much space as it can within those bounds. But then we can see that we do have that two-stage cropping and resizing that I was alluding to, where we could technically include it by default along with this. But again, we might have some transformations in between those two things, and it makes more sense to crop the source of the image before we apply any of those other transformations. And this is probably more relevant if you're using things like overlays or other kind of relative size transformations, but it's just kind of best practice to kind of get in the habit of doing that. But now we have two others that we need to actually apply. So we have our landscape and portrait. Back inside the code, we're going to do a similar thing for each and every one of these, but not exactly the same. So I'm going to start off by saying else if crop equals landscape. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to apply that same crop to both of these. So let me just copy and paste this one between both of our different transformations. We have portrait as well as landscape, but now is where we need to actually do a little math. So let's think about this for a second. If we have an image that is landscape, let's make that 16 by 9. That's a pretty common landscape format. And if I have a different width and a height, what I ultimately want is I want to have a normal width that I kind of fix in on, and I want to set my height relative to that width. Now you can probably go the other way around depending on what you want to do, but ultimately let's use that as the basis for how we want to actually define the height to transform this into a landscape image. So I'm going to start off by adding transformations.height, and I'm going to set that equal to resource.width, but then I'm going to actually divide resources width by the ratio that I want to apply. So that's going to be 16 by 9. Now that's probably going to give a fraction or a decimal in this case, and we want that to be a nice integer. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap that with math.for. That way it's a little bit easier to work with, especially when we're trying to not have some kind of like subpixel rendering. Now back inside the app, let's try this out real quick. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page just to make sure that settings is all completely up to date. But now let's try to set that to landscape, where we can see that it's already working and we can kind of already see the width and height of what's actually happening. Now let's close this, but we can see that it automatically cropped that image to that landscape format. Now that image looks a little grainy to me. I think that image just itself isn't the highest quality. We can see that if I zoom in on this, it isn't the highest quality image to begin with. But we can see that all we needed to really do was pass in those dynamic values along with our crop of fill in order to really easily get that nice crop. Now let's go ahead and try to test this out on another one just to kind of see another example where let's go ahead and upload an image. I have this nice image here. I'm going to upload it. I'm going to select it. And as it's loading, I'm going to go ahead and open up the panel where we can find that crop, and let's try to set that to landscape. And one thing that that's interesting that I wanted to point out is not only is this going to crop our image, but it's going to do so intelligently. We can see that it's trying to find the most interesting part of the image and crop to that. Now let's open this up in a new tab to try to see what's going on, where we can see that in the URL, we also have this G_auto. That stands for gravity of auto, where gravity is basically going to be the focal point or the anchor of wherever we want to set it for the image. Now by default with Cloudinary, if you don't set it, it's going to default to center. But with CLD image and the Next.js library, we're automatically adding gauto, so it can be a little bit more intelligent work for how this works. But let's kind of see what this looks like. If I remove gauto, we can see that we get a different crop entirely, and it's just using the center. And we can see that we have that reflection, but that's not really giving the most interesting part of the shot, which is the image itself. So we can see that when we have gauto, it's determining that this is the most interesting part of the image, and it's prioritizing that in how it's cropping the image. But now that we have the landscape all covered, let's now add portrait. So this is going to look really similar. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this in, only we're going to swap the different values. So it's going to be transformations width and transformations height. And now I'm going to go back and let's select a new image or upload a new image for fun. So I'm going to go ahead and select a new one. Let's go ahead and add this one. Once it's uploaded, I'm going to go ahead and open the edit panel. Let's go ahead and select portrait this time. And we can see that it's of course loading. And once it loads, we can see that it's actually zoomed in way too far, and we just got to make a quick tweak to the application here. Now, this was intended to be somewhat out of scope for this project, but we can kind of review what's actually happening here for how we're displaying the image, because one of the problems that we wanted to solve is how can we display that image within the canvas so that it's responsive no matter what the viewport is going to look like, whether it's tall or whether it's wide, which can be challenging when you're just trying to use CSS alone. Now, with JavaScript, we could probably do that, but then we would have to add all that JavaScript. So what we're doing is inside of this application, we're first determining the canvas height and the canvas width. We're determining if it's a square, landscape, or portrait image, and then we're adding different styles to the image based off of that. So if it's a landscape image, we're setting a max width along with the width of 100% and a height of auto, where if it's a portrait or square, we're setting a max height of that actual height. We're defining a height of 100 viewport height and the width of auto. And again, this gives us the ability to have an image that's going to scale nicely inside of that canvas in the image viewer. Now, where that's getting applied is if we go down to the bottom of CLD image, we're just setting that in the styles tag. But ultimately, the issue here is we're still using the resource height. We're not using the transformations height. So what we're going to do is we're going to add to the beginning of this, we're going to say if transformations.height actually exists, we're going to use that first. And similarly, we're going to do the same for our width. So we need to make sure we update that width as well. But as soon as we update that value, we can now see that we do have that nice portrait image and it's able to scale nicely. So I can show you that. I'm going to close the panel. We see that it does fit really nice and center in there. It's going to scale nicely. If we go back to the landscape version, whether that's that or the original version, let's just go to the original and I close, we can see that it's dynamically based off of that value going to scale really nicely inside that canvas. So just a little quick CSS tip there. But to my point, if we go back to that portrait image, that was the whole goal here, where we do now have that nice portrait image that we were able to dynamically crop and resize. So now after we have that, we have all the different ones we wanted to add. We have our original, which is just the original. We have the square, we have the landscape, and we have our portrait. So now I think the last thing that we need to do here is actually just update these icons. Now, luckily for us, we have some pretty simple icons we can use. We're going to just simply use square. We're going to use rectangle, where we have both a horizontal and we have a vertical rectangle. So let's go ahead and add those. We have our square, which is going to be square. We can go ahead and import that. We have our landscape, which is going to be rectangle horizontal. We can go ahead and import that. And then finally, our rectangle vertical. And finally, import that. Did I spell it wrong? It looks like I didn't spell it wrong. It looks like I just simply tried to do it before it was actually ready for it. But now we have all those imports imported and our updated UI to go along with it. So I think that's looking pretty good. Let's take a look at what we got so far. We have both of our enhancements with all the different options. We have our cropping and resizing with all of our different options. And now finally, we get to add our filters. Now, our filters are again going to work the same exact way as we did our enhancements and our cropping, but a little bit more fun, where we can see here we're using an image to display this, because the nice thing about this is because of the way that it kind of works, it's a lot easier to show a visual representation of it inside the UI, since we can just show a bunch of square images that include that filter, rather than trying to wedge in all those different sizes, all the different enhancements, and having all that processing in the UI. This is going to be quick and easy for being able to show a visual way to show those different filters and effects. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just update this image to a CLD image. So let's add CLD image. We can add this as our resource.public ID. We can set this in a second here, but with our resource and height, we don't need that image to be that big. Looking inside of the panel after it updates, we can see that, well, it looks okay. We have our image, it's using that resource width and height, but let's actually open this up in a new tab. That image is way larger than we would ever need in that little space. Let's actually see what the rendered size of that is. If we look at that, that's only currently 156 pixels wide. So because we're using dynamic cropping and resizing, I can just simply set that value on the image itself. So I'm going to set my width as 156, and I'm going to also set my height as 156, because instead of showing that original size, I'm just going to show squares so that it always looks appropriate and doesn't create really long lists, and it doesn't create really short lists. It's pretty consistent in the UI. Now, the only thing that I'm going to add in addition to that is crop of fill, so that it takes that space and actually gives me that crop. Otherwise, it's just going to use that value in the DOM, which is just going to kind of skew it. But we can see that it was already updated, and we now have this nice little representation of our image. And best yet, if we look over this image, we can see that the intrinsic size is that 384, and it's able to do so because it's generating that dynamic source set of the 1x and 2x image. And because I'm on a Retina display, it's showing that 2x image. So now at this point, let's actually have some fun with this and start to add some filters. Probably some of the easiest filters to add to images are called artistic effects in Cloudinary. And if we look at some of these examples here, we have a ton of different filters that we can apply. We're not going to add all these. I'm just going to pick a select few, but ultimately the way that this syntax works, and let me look at the URL syntax for a second here and hide myself. We can see that the way that this works is it's e_art and then that filter name. Inside the Next Cloudinary documentation, it's going to work a little bit differently, where a lot of these are going to just be top level options that we can add. Where, for instance, let's add sepia, which is a pretty common filter, where I'm going to go ahead and clone this list item, where let's now add sepia. And we can already see in our panel that it already added that second option with that sepia effect. So now let's add two more, where let's clone this another 2 more times. And as far as what filters to use, how about I want to use sizzle for this one. Now, sizzle's not available as a top level prop, but what is this art prop, where we can pass in any of those strings that correlate to one of those artistic filters. So back on CLD image for my next filter, I'm going to change sepia to art equals sizzle. And looking inside of my options, we can see that it gives a nice effect to that image. Now, as my last one, how about we use grayscale? Because that's a good common one to want to use. So this time I'm going to replace sepia with grayscale. And we can see we have nice 4 options, including the original, for the different filters that people can add. And you can feel free to add as many as you'd like. Now be sure when we're adding all these to add an alt description for all these, such as grayscale. We can add our sizzle. We can add sepia, and then we can keep no filter when we want that undefined. But now back at the top of the code, let's do the same thing that we did before and now create our state for filter. So I'm going to go ahead and clone my crop. I'm going to set that to set filter, update the F there. And now for this one, I'm going to scroll below my crop, where I'm going to say if filter, where I'm going to do things a little bit differently than I did for the past two, because we know that 2 of these, grayscale and sepia, are top level props. So instead, I'm going to create an array that includes grayscale and my sepia, and I'm going to say if this array includes filter, then I'm going to actually do something in a second here. But we can see we do get a type error, so we also need to add if type of filter equals string, just to make sure TypeScript is actually happy here. But now let's actually add the transformation to our transformations object. So I'm going to say transformations filter equals true, because we're basically setting that Boolean on that prop to true, since that's what it accepts. And we can do a similar thing to that with the enhancement, because specifically restore, improve, and maybe not remove background unless you rename the key for this, but these all can do that same thing. So you can apply the similar approach to that. But for this one, we can see we also need to make TypeScript happy for this. So I'm going to say as key of transformations, and we can make sure that that's going to specify that that key needs to be included as part of that transformations type. So we can see now that if we have a filter that includes a top level prop, let's just simply apply it as a Boolean. And for the last one, we know that if it's sizzle, we just need to set that value as the art prop. Now, technically, we could probably do a similar thing to what we did with the top level props, where we know that these art filters, there's going to be multiple values of those. So if we look for all the keys that are going to be art filters, we can apply it to that singular prop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this if statement, and I'm going to say else if filter equals string, and we can pull that up to make it a little bit cleaner if we wanted to, but I'm going to replace this array and I'm going to say sizzle. And honestly, we could add all those other filters we want, such as frost if we want, but for now, I'm just adding only sizzle. But then we can say if transformations.art equals filter. That way it's going to apply whatever art effect that we include in here as an art filter. Now, we only coded up the core logic for this, so let's actually make this interactive and work. The nice thing is we already did this 2 other times, so we know exactly what we need to do. We need to set these on-click handlers for each and every one of our different options and make sure that it has a dynamic value so that it shows that border only if it's being used. So I'm going to go ahead and first of all collapse down these buttons like I usually do, just to make it a little bit easier to read as we're working through this. But now I'm going to go ahead and first of all copy that on click. I'm going to add this to each of those buttons. And then I'm going to start to actually set what that's going to be. So we have set crop, that'll be set filter. And then I can start to add my undefined. I'm going to add my sepia, sizzle, and finally grayscale. Now, of course, we need to also set our dynamic borders. So let's go ahead and copy that as well. So we have crop equals portrait. I'm going to replace this border of white for each of those and now set this to be filter. So if filter equals, or rather if filter equals undefined, of course, if filter equals sepia, if filter equals sizzle, and finally filter equals grayscale. So when we pull it up, we can now see that it's currently selected on no filter because we don't have anything selected, but let's try adding sepia, where we can see after it loads, we now have that sepia effect. If we want to add sizzle, we get sizzle as well. And finally grayscale, and we get that nice effect. Now, to be clear, it's only going to take that long to load the very first time that you run this filter or whatever effect, because what's actually happening behind the scenes is Cloudinary is going to process that image the first time, and then it's going to store it in cache. So we can see as we're flipping through these images now, it's already cached on Cloudinary CDN, so it loads super fast. But what we can see is we now have these filters, and you can really add as many as you'd like to really give a cool effect for the different images that we have. But now we have one problem. I was able to add all these really cool filters and effects to all of my different images, but how do we actually save this? Now, as you might have noticed as we've been working through this, we do have this save button, and we also have this little drop down for save as copy. So we can just hook into these and we can trigger a save on the image itself to get this moving. So inside of our edit panel at the bottom, you'll find the sheet footer, where we can see that we have that save option, which is just a button that we have available. And we're using this drop-down menu from shadcn in order to show more options, and specifically we're showing the save as copy. Now previously, the only uploading that we've done so far is using the upload button, and that's all been handled automatically for us. So now we need to create our own endpoint so that we can send those uploads straight to Cloudinary. Now starting off, let's add the click handler to our save button. So I'm going to add on click, and let's call that handle on save. And I'm going to go to the top of the file so I can define this function. And the way that I like to structure my components is I like to have all the state, and then I have the use effects kind of after that. And then I like to define the functions after that, kind of close to the bottom, just to make it a little bit easier for me to kind of find where everything is. So how about with these already defined functions, I'm going to add my new function of handle on save. Let's just add a little note here because it just helps it easier to scan and find these things. Now to actually save this image, the first thing we need to do is we need to grab the data for the changes that we're actually going to save to this particular file. Now, the way that it's structured is, if you remember, all these are just URL parameters inside of a big URL. So what we're going to do is we're going to just grab that URL, and then we're going to send that to the actual upload process. Now, in order to construct that URL, we don't need to do any fancy hacking around to maybe grab it from CLD image. We can import a new function called getCLDImageURL. Now you can learn more about this inside of the Next.js docs, but this is going to have the same exact API as CldImage, only you're passing it as a function which returns a URL. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go to handle on save, where I'm going to now create constant URL is equal to my get CldImage URL. And I'm going to actually go to CldImage, which is the bottom one. I'm going to grab all these props, including the transformations, and I'm going to actually paste them inside as my options. And I can get rid of the alt because that doesn't matter. I can get rid of the styles because that doesn't matter, but I can now change these into properties so that I'm passing that through and basically constructing it the same way that I would for the CldImage to just grab the URL. Now, kind of proving that this works the way that I'm talking about, let's console log out our URL. And now hitting the save button, we can see that it spit out a URL, but now let's open that up in a new tab, where once it loads, we can see it's the exact same image that we were actually seeing inside of our media library. Now, before we actually pass this URL through as is and save it, one thing that I do want to call out is if we look back in the URL, remember we're including fauto by default, which inside of a browser, it's automatically going to deliver that most efficient format. But when we send this to a serverless endpoint, it's essentially a node environment, and we're not going to have that signal from the browser to determine what format to actually send through. So we probably don't want to include fauto. It'll probably work, but it just will potentially give unexpected results. So what we want to do instead is we just want to remove fauto from this picture entirely so that we don't need to consider and be a little bit more consistent and reliable for the results that we get. So because get CldImage URL and CldImage use fauto by default, we need to opt out of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to also pass in a format of default, which is just saying that we want to use the default format that is inherent to the image itself. Now, to similarly point out another one, we also have QAuto, which stands for quality of auto, which I don't think we covered yet, which is going to automatically compress the image to a point that's not going to be visually different. So we're trying to get as high quality of a result as we can by compressing it as much as we can. It uses AI under the hood to do that, which is pretty amazing. But nonetheless, it depends on if we want to upload the original asset or if we want to upload a compressed asset. And I think because we're going to now save that image, and then in the future where we might apply more transformations, we probably want to use the default quality, right? That way we're not over compressing things again and again and again. So let's do the same thing that we did with format, but with quality. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this and add quality of default. And again, when you're using these URLs inside of the browser and you're showing these to visitors, you always want fauto and QAuto because that's going to give your visitors the best experience possible. But we're going to be taking this URL and we're going to be overwriting the original image with the new transformations. So we probably want to retain as much quality as we can inside of our original asset. Now, just to kind of drive that concept home a little bit more is I want to point out that inside of your media library, we have all of our originally uploaded assets. Now, when we create those transformations, we can create new versions of that as much as we want with those little URL parameters, but that never impacts that original image. So what's happening is we're creating derivatives of those where you have that original image and then you can apply dynamic transformations as much as you want. But again, those never impact the original image. But what we're going to do is because we want to apply those transformations and then save those transformations, we will overwrite the original image. Now, just to be clear, we're also going to be adding an option to save as copy so that you have the option to either overwrite the image or you have the option to save it as a copy, depending on what you want to do, but just making clear what we're actually going to be doing here. But now that we have this generated URL that we can use to save our image, let's actually save it. So what we're going to do is we're going to create that API endpoint so that we can send this URL and then overwrite the file. So I'm going to open back up my sidebar where under source app API, I'm going to go ahead and just duplicate our existing resources API. And I'm going to call that upload. That way it just gives me a little bit of a starting point where we already import the SDK, we're configuring it. So it just makes it a little bit easier for me. But what we're going to do inside of here is, first of all, it's currently a get. Let's make this a post because we're going to be sending data to this endpoint. And then we want to change this from actually requesting a resource to now uploading a resource. So I'm going to get rid of this sidebar just to give us a little bit more room, but I'm going to say constant results is equal to await cloudinary.uploader.upload. And then I'm going to pass in my URL as that first argument. And this upload option takes a few different formats, including actual image data. So you can check out the documentation, but because we're only ever going to use a URL, I'm going to just simply pass through that URL as is. Now, as far as getting the data to our endpoint, we kind of have two good options where we have form data and we have JSON. Now, form data would probably be the best option if we're actually passing in raw image data, but because we're only ever going to be using a URL in our instance, JSON probably works just fine. So what I'm going to do is, first off, this post request is going to take a first argument of request, which I can type out as a standard web request. And then I'm going to say my params is equal to await request.json. And then I'm going to actually destructure the URL from that JSON. Now, once we actually have the results, we can simply pass this back as the data. But let's head back over and let's test this out before we do anything else. Back inside my handle on save, now I can do await fetch, and I can do my /API/upload. I'm going to set the method of post. I'm going to add my body, which will json.stringify, and we'll add our URL. Now we can see I'm getting a syntax error on await, and that's because the handle on save, I never made an async function, of course. But then let's add constant results for our fetch request, and let's try to actually log that out. I'm going to log that out separately from the URL just so that we can debug if we need to. So pulling that back up, I'm going to hit save. And once that upload returns, first of all, we can see that URL and we see that we do get a basic response and we get a status of 200. So it seems like it's okay. Now, I never actually transformed this into JSON. Let's see if I can just store this as a global variable instead of having to redo it. Let's do await temp1 JSON. And we can see our data, which is going to include that uploaded asset. So that means that it worked. Perfect. Now we have one problem here. This flow would actually work perfectly for save as copy, but we want to actually save and overwrite our existing image. Now, heading over to the Cloudinary upload documentation for a second, let's scroll down until we get to this public ID parameter. Now, what we want to do is we're currently uploading that file, but we're just uploading it as a new file. What we want to do is we want to overwrite the existing file. So what we can do is we can pass in that public ID of our existing file. So when we do so, we're saying we don't want to just upload this, we want to overwrite that public ID. Now, another parameter that I also want to point out is overwrite, where we can see here, this is going to allow us to control whether or not, if we pass in a public ID, that we do overwrite that existing asset. Now, this defaults to true, so we don't actually have to set it. But if you want to try uploading with your own public ID and you don't want to overwrite if it actually exists, then in that case, you would want to set it to false. But we're not going to set it to anything because by default, again, it is true. So when we use a public ID, it will overwrite that file for us. So what this practically means for us is inside of this upload request, I'm going to also add public ID, which is going to be our resource.public ID. Now over inside of the endpoint, I'm going to also destructure that public ID, and then I'm going to add that to the upload where we're going to specify upload options here. Now, I want to create this upload options object on the fly because we want to do this dynamically, specifically because we're going to reuse this endpoint for our save on copy. We don't always want to try to send in a public ID. So first off, I'm going to create constant upload options and set that equal to an empty object. But then I'm going to say if type of public ID equals string, let's now set upload options public ID to our public ID. Now to keep TypeScript happy, let's make sure we define this as a record with a string, but then I'm going to take these upload options and I'm going to pass it in as a second argument to our upload method. So now let's give this a try again. So I'm going to go ahead and click save, and we're going to wait a second. If we want, we can open the network request, but we already see that we have our results. And again, I forgot to log it out as JSON. So let's store that as a variable. And then I'm going to do the same thing and await that to my JSON. And if we start to look at the data, we can see that this should be the same image signature or the same URL as it was before, except maybe a version change. So let me open up this image in a new URL. And we can see that we do have that new image. And we can see if I actually try to refresh the page on the main image itself, that that's also updated as well. I now have the ability to go in and crop and resize this new image to however I want. And then of course, save that optionally if I wanted to. But there's a little bit of an edge case that we need to cover here. Let's go back to one of our original images and let's try this one, for instance. When we looked at this image, we're looking at it without any URL parameters with it. So we never actually looked at the original image in its original state. So let's just open this image up in a new tab for a moment. I'm going to get rid of all the URL parameters associated with it, just so that we can prime that in cache. But now I'm going to add some filters to this. Let's go ahead and just add some cropping and resizing. Let's add one of our other filters to it. How about for this one, let's add sepia. I think that looks kind of nice. And we can let it load for a second. It probably doesn't matter too much, but ultimately we have our image and now let's try to save that. So I hit my save just like before. Let's let that load in. And something actually happened this time. We're getting a 500 response. What's going on here? If I open up the terminal, I get this error of error in loading that URL. Now, as I mentioned before, when we're actually loading this URL from Cloudinary, the very first thing that it does is Cloudinary tries to process this image, apply all the transformations and everything to it so that it can then store it in the cache. And afterwards, we can see that it loads super fast, right? But in that process, if we try to upload the image before it was ever processed, it needs to both do that processing on the fly and then upload. And it might not always be able to do that within the timeout time, or generally speaking, it's just probably general best practices not to try to upload an image that also needs to process first. So what we can do is we can prime that URL and pre-process it so that we can then push it straight forward to the uploader function. So all I'm simply going to do is before we actually do the upload request, I'm going to add await fetch, and then I'm going to pass in that URL, and that's simply going to prime that URL for us and pre-process it for when we actually upload it. And as while we're here, I'm going to now transform this result to JSON just to make it a little bit easier to read. So now let's go back and I'm going to go ahead and try that again. And this time we can see we got our results and it looks like everything was happy because we did get a successful response. Now here's another snag that we're going to hit. If I go back to this URL and I actually try to refresh the page, we can see that we get the original image where what's going on? We just saved that image and overwrote it, right? Now, if you remember before we hit that first snag, the thing that I originally wanted to point out is that we were priming this original URL. If you remember, we went in here, we stripped the URL parameters and we just loaded the original image. So what we were doing is we were loading this image into cache before we ever actually hit it in a separate upload request. Now that's where the problem lies, where because it's in cache, it doesn't just simply automatically invalidate. We need to tell it that we want to invalidate all copies of that URL. Now, just to point out in the documentation, we can see that it does make a note that we will want to invalidate the assets, specifically if we're using versions and we want those versions to be invalidated, because that's another mechanism that we can use. But in this case, we probably want to invalidate all the different options because we do want to save that original asset. If you do want to learn more about how that invalidation works, you can check out this page, Invalidate Cached Assets, which you can find by searching in the documentation. But to actually make this happen, we're going to just simply pass in this invalidate parameter and we're going to set it to true. So inside of our API route, because we know we're passing in a public ID, and if we're passing in a public ID, that means we want to overwrite an image, we're going to add that additional invalidate and set it to true inside of that if statement. But now we see that we get an error because we're trying to set a Boolean. So all we got to do is say that this can also be a Boolean. But just to validate this is working, let's try and do this on another image. How about I'm just going to recrop this same existing image. So let's prime this one as well. But to get rid of those other tabs, let's strip all the URL parameters so that we have our original image, which is going to be that transformed image that we already have. But now let's head back. Let's open up the edit panel. Let's make this a square. I can add a new filter. Let's make this one grayscale. And now I'm going to hit save. Now you probably want to add some kind of loading indicator to this just so that people don't think that the UI is stalled when you're actually saving. But nonetheless, we already got back our results. We can look inside and we have that image. Now let's go ahead and refresh this page to see if that worked. And we now see that we do have our nice cropped image because it did save, it overwrote that image and it invalidated the cache for us. We can even see if we hit the back button that it's already updated in our original page. Now we have this save functionality worked out, but what happens after the save? So if I head back in here and if I actually hit the save button, Nothing's going to happen afterwards. Now, what I want to happen is I want to close this panel as long as that save is actually successful and complete. Now, if you're following along with the starter template, I already have this option or function rather called close menus, which essentially just hides all those panels. It closes all the UI. And this is something that we don't necessarily need to cover in this course, but essentially that's just my function I can call in order to easily get rid of that UI. So I'm going to take that close menus, and after I know that it was successfully saved, I'm going to add close menus. And let's get rid of those console logs. And let's just give that a quick try. We don't have anything on this, of course, but let's just see if it closes, and it did. So next, what I want to also do is if I have any of these transformations applied, such as a landscape or whatever I wanted to actually apply, I wanted also to reset all those transformations because now the original asset is the asset that I want to show. So I want to make sure that those are clear so that it's going to give me the option to go back and now add new transformations. Now for this one, I don't have a function already available to easily do this, but what I'm going to need to do is if we scroll back up to our state, we're going to need to set enhancement, set crop, and set filter. And for each of those, we're essentially just going to want to set it to undefined to reset that state. So I'm going to go back to where I have that close menu. Where is it? Closes menu. Eventually find it. I'm going to create another function underneath, and let's call this discard changes because this is something that we could use in the future as well. Again, I'm going to just add that little note because I like to have it a little bit easier to find. For now, I'm going to get rid of that description. But here, let's add set enhancement to undefined. We'll do the same thing to set filter and the same thing to set crop. And now let's take this discard changes and we're going to do the same thing with that. So I already have my landscape. I'm going to add another filter and oh, that's a cool little effect here. But now I'm going to hit save again. We can see that it closed it. If I go back up into my transformations, we can see that everything was actually reset. Now, another thing that you might have noticed is that original image, or rather that new image, is currently being displayed because we invalidated that. Now, sometimes the way that it'll work is if you remember in previous examples, we needed to force a state rendering for it to actually refresh that image. Now, it seems like that's automatically happening, but to be sure, to make sure that we get that loading UI so that it is showing some kind of indicator as we're waiting for it to load, what we can do is we can set a version on the URL so that it'll force whatever that new version is, and we can just use the date for that. So up where I'm defining my state, I'm going to add a version, and I'm going to add set version or singular. Now for a default value, I'm just going to set that as 1, and I want to make this a number as well because we're going to use a date timestamp. Now where I'm closing my menu and discarding my changes, what I can do is I can say set version, and I can just use date.now. And what date.now is going to give me is basically a number that's going to represent the current time, date time. Now heading down to my CLD image, which I'm displaying on the page, I'm going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to add it as the key to force that re-render, but I'm also going to add it to the image itself just to make sure that the image itself is going to be providing the most recent version. And again, with the invalidation, that shouldn't be a problem, but this is really just a kind of safety net for us. So I'm going to wrap the JSON stringify with that string, then I'm going to add my version, and then I'm going to simply pass along my version as a version for the URL. And again, because we weren't really experiencing any issues, we shouldn't really notice too much of a difference, but let's go ahead and just apply something. I'm going to add portrait, and we can see with all the different edits, because we're layering over and over and over, the image is getting smaller, so it's getting a little bit blurry, but nonetheless, let's go ahead and click save. And as I do that, I'm going to hide the panel. We can see that the panel was hidden and that we had that image refresh, and we even had that little loading indicator while that happened. Now, if I refresh the page, we can see that the image does look good. So maybe there's just a responsive image issue for when we're applying those transformations. Let me show that again. We have that square image, or maybe we can add the landscape. Or anyways, because we went from the big image to the small images, maybe there's just a logic hiccup in that canvas logic that we showed before, which made it show a lot bigger than it actually was. But we can see that with our changes that it looks pretty good, and we have that portrait and it's not way overblown. Now, before we move on to adding save as copy, which should be pretty simple, I do want to do one thing. So inside of our panel, we currently show that save no matter what. And that probably doesn't make a lot of sense because we only want to save something if it actually has changes. So inside of my code, the way that we can determine if we have any changes is we can inspect this transformations object. So what I'm going to do is at the bottom of all the different effects that I'm adding, I'm going to say object.entries transformations, and I'm going to check the length of that to see if it's greater than 0. I'm going to set that to a constant of has transformations. I got to make sure that I actually spell that right. But now what I can do is I can take that has transformations. Let's go to handle on save. We found the button, and now I can just wrap this entire area with that, and specifically this div here. So I'm going to say has transformations, and I'm going to indent this div, and now we have that wrapped with that logic. So let's see if that works. We can immediately see that that save button is no longer there, but let's try to add a transformation. Let's add square. We can see that it popped right back in. Now we could probably also update how we're wording this close button, where if we have changes, maybe we want to cancel the changes instead of just simply close. So around the same area, we can do something similar where if we head down and find that close, I'm going to say has transformations. Let's add cancel. Otherwise, we'll have the close. And maybe we want to also update the color of this button so that maybe it's red if we have transformations and want to cancel them, just to make it a little bit more prominent that we're going to lose those changes. So I'm going to change class name to make it a dynamic value, hide myself here just to make sure it's clear. And we're going to say if has transformations, let's make this BG red 500. Otherwise, we're going to add that BG of transparent. And we can now similarly see that because we do have a change, we see both the save as well as the cancel. If we get rid of it, we can see that we do show that close button. But if I hit cancel, it doesn't actually cancel those changes. It just collapses the menu. So let's fix that quick. So when I hit this button, I don't want to just close the menu. I also want to use that discard changes function. So I'm going to just break this open, and I could probably abstract this to a new function for that handler if I want, but for now, let's just add discard changes. And this time when I actually hit cancel, we can see that it reverted to its original state and canceled all the transformations that we had applied. So this save functionality worked really well, but now let's implement this save as copy. Now, like I mentioned earlier, this is going to work really similar to how we did this handle on save. So I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to find the menu item that's wrapping my save as copy text. I'm going to add on click, and let's call this function handle on save copy. And now I'm going to go back up to where we're defining handle on save. And the first thing I'm going to do is just simply clone this function just to give us a good starting point for how we're creating this. So let's rename that to handle on save copy. We're going to do the same thing where we're going to create the URL. But one of the bigger things is we're going to not pass in the public ID this time. And if you remember, inside of our API route, we're dynamically overriding that file only if we pass in that public ID. So it should just work and upload it as a new copy when it comes back with the results. So let's go ahead and console log that out. Where now if I open that up and hit save on copy, we can see that we did get those results. Now, we also saw in the background that it did reset the image. Now let's look through this and let's open up this secure URL. Let me hide myself. Looking through, I have my secure URL. We can see that we do have that original image. Now, also let me check the asset ID, E6246. Yeah, that's different from the resource asset ID that we're on. So we did successfully create that new asset, but we're still on the original asset. So as far as the UI goes, how about we redirect them to this new asset? So back inside of the code, because I'm going to push them to a new page, first of all, I can probably get rid of the menu item and change discards from the below. But what we're going to do is we're going to use the Next.js router and push them to the new page. So I'm going to go first of all to the top of my page. I'm going to import use router from Next navigation. Then if I scroll down to my component, the first thing I want to do is I want it to say constant router is equal to use router, so I can create a new instance to interface with it. And then if we scroll down to our handle on save copy, we can now use that router where we're going to use router.push, where I'm going to create a dynamic path of /resources, where I'm going to pass in that dynamic value. Now, if we remember, this is going to have a property of data first off. So I'm going to say data.assetID. So now let's give this a try. I'm going to go ahead and add a transformation. I'm going to go ahead and click Save as Copy, where we can see once it's saved, it pushed us to that new page, which is going to reference that new asset. Now we do have one problem here. Let me hit back for a second. We don't have that asset available in our media library. If you remember in our code, we're currently querying our resources by a specific tag, and we never added that tag, so it probably makes sense that it's not showing. So what I can do inside of the API endpoint, I can say else upload options tags, where I can now set it equal to include that tag, where if I head back over, I can quickly copy the tag string and paste it inside of my tags. And the reason that I'm currently doing an else statement here is if we're uploading our public ID and overriding the image, I don't want to wipe all the existing tags if there's already tags on it. Where here, we're uploading a new image, so there aren't any tags on it unless we specify those tags. Now we can see that TypeScript is yelling at us because we are passing in an array with a string. So we need to do one last thing and add array of string. And we could probably make this look a little bit cleaner, pull up an upload option, for instance, and have that in there. But for now, that should work as expected. But now let's try it again. So let's go back to that image. I'm going to crop it to a square. I'm going to hit Save as Copy. And after it uploads, we can see we went to the new page. That works as expected. But if we hit back, we do need to refresh because we didn't invalidate the queries for this page. We do see that new image. But okay, we have the ability to save our images in multiple ways. But what about deleting those images? Now, getting rid of my DevTools for a second, if I click this delete button, we can see that we currently get this modal. It's basically a confirmation dialog that just makes us actually delete it if we only want to delete it, so we actually know what we're doing and didn't accidentally click. But nonetheless, when we click this button, we want to actually delete that asset. Now, using the Cloudinary admin API, we do have a nice endpoint for being able to delete our resources. It's simply delete_resources. So first off, jumping back inside the code, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate my upload endpoint. So I'm going to say delete and call this my API for deletion. Where inside, we already have a similar boilerplate. We have our importing, we have our configuration, and we're going to be able to get rid of some of this stuff, but we can also keep some of it to make it a little bit easier. Now, let me get rid of my sidebar. Let's first clean up. We don't need any of these upload options. Now, we do need the public ID because we're going to delete it by the public ID, and then let's get rid of the URL. But now, instead of the uploader, we're going to use cloudinary.api.delete resources. Now, resources takes an array where we can pass this public ID directly to it. And we can still just pass through these results as is, but keep in mind also that this is going to be a post endpoint. And because I duplicated the upload endpoint, it already is a post request. But now let's head back over to our media viewer UI and start to look for that delete. Where if we remember, when we click that original button at the top navigation, it's going to open that modal. So we really only need to interact with the modal button, where we can see here that we have our dialog, and that includes that button for deletion. So the first thing I'm going to do, of course, is I'm going to add my onClick handler, and let's call this handle on delete. And now let's take this and actually define it. Handle on save. I'm going to add it to a similar location that we did to the save endpoints. So I'm going to add my function, an async function rather, handle on delete, where inside I can run await fetch. I'm going to hit my /API delete endpoint, make it a method of post, pass in my body, JSON.stringify, where I can pass in my public ID as resource.public ID. And really, to delete it, that's all we need to do. So let's test this out quick. So we can stick with this current one because it's not the greatest image. So let's get rid of it. Let's hit delete. And if we wait a second, of course, we never did anything with the UI, so nothing's going to happen. But let's try to refresh the page. We can see that we no longer get a good page. We're getting an error, and we could probably clean up these errors just to make sure that it's a little bit more understandable what's actually happening, but it's because we deleted it and we no longer have that information to feed into the UI. So if we head back to our homepage, we can see that we no longer have that image, of course. So the first thing that we can do is if we do have a successful deletion, let's push them to that homepage. So I'm going to add router.push, and I'm just going to simply reference the homepage. We can go ahead and try this on another asset. How about this one? Because the cache isn't quite invalidated for all the different variations. So let's click delete. I'm going to hit delete. And we can see that we were moved to the homepage. Now it didn't update, of course, again, because of the query invalidation, but let's refresh the page. and we can see that it's gone. Now, for all intents and purposes, this is probably just fine, but as we alluded to earlier, we can add some little interactions to make it clear what's happening. And while I'll save the save functionality for you, how about when we're on delete, let's update that little button so that it has a little loading spinner to indicate that it is currently deleting. So if I go to the UI, what we want to do is we currently already have this deletion state that I'm using in order to control the modal opening or closing, which we'll get to in a second. But what we're going to do is, depending on that state, we're going to show a different button. So first off, let's go to deletion so that we can see what this state looks like. Where currently it's just a string. In that string, we have our deletion, and the only thing that we're currently setting it to is undefined, or I think I missed it there, or we're going to set it to confirm, which confirm is just controlling the dialog to be open. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that this dialog is indeed open on the states that we want it to be open on. And maybe not just any state, only on the states that we specify. Currently, if the state is defined, it's going to be open. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say if deletion and the deletion state, and we're going to use that array includes again, like we did before. I can get rid of that optional chaining because we're checking for it first. But let's add, first of all, I think it's confirm. And then let's add another one of deleting where I added an extra E there. But then when we're actually triggering that handle on delete, let's set deletion and we'll set that to our state of deleting. Now, first things first, if we are in that deleting state, let's show a different icon. Let's show a spinner icon. So I'm going to say for my deletion state, if deletion state equals deleting, we're going to do one thing. Otherwise, we're going to do the other thing, which will be our trash icon. So we're going to say if it does not equal the deleting, and because we're going to use the same word delete for both of them, I'm just going to keep that outside. But now let's just duplicate this because we're going to replace this with a loader, where if we head to Lucid, we can see that we have a few different loaders that we can choose from, where I specifically liked this loader 2. I'll make sure that I update this to import it, but we also need to make sure that we're adding our optional chaining for this state to begin with. Where the only other thing that I'm going to do is on this loader icon, I also want to add my Tailwind class to actually animate it. So I'm going to add animate spin. Now, as one more thing, I don't want somebody to be able to click on this button twice if it's in that loading state. Now, depending on who you ask, there's a lot of strong opinions about disabling button UI, but I don't want somebody to be able to click this if it's already deleting and trigger that second deletion request if it's going to just error. So what I want to happen is if it is deleting, I don't want anything to happen if they click it. So we kind of have one of two options where we can either just disable it on the button itself, or we can use the event handler and use JavaScript to disable it. So let's do that one. I'm going to copy that and head up to handle on delete. And if our state is in that deleting state, let's just simply return. Now going back to the UI, let's pick another one, delete. How about let's delete that really fuzzy one that we had from before when we were testing the AI. I'm going to click delete. Let's click the delete button. We can see that it's spinning and loading, and we were pushed back to the home page. And let's refresh, and we can now see it's gone. So now let's take a quick moment to handle that invalidation issue that we were seeing, where when we go back to the home page, we want to make sure that that refreshes the query inside of the client. As a quick refresher, when we were originally creating our use resources hook for that media library homepage, we used the use query client in order to invalidate after we added a resource. So we can see we imported use query client, we grabbed the query client itself, and then we both set data and invalidated. Where here, we're only going to need to invalidate the queries, but we're going to do that in the media viewer. So let's give that a try, where first I'm going to import the use query client at the top of my media viewer file, where I only need the use query client, so I'm going to only import that. I'm going to go ahead and then grab that query client statement and go to the top of my media viewer, paste that in, where then I can grab that invalidation, which let's just take a moment to refresh on that, where it's running invalidate queries. I'm passing in a query key, which equates to my resources as well as my library tag, so that it's going to revalidate that request and force a new one. So let's go ahead and copy that one as well. I'm going to head over to Media Viewer and then handle on delete at the very end of that. Right before we push to the home page, I'm going to go ahead and invalidate those queries. Now let's take a quick second to test that out. Where here, let's delete the Northern Lights to begin with, where at the top right, I'm going to click delete, and then I'm going to confirm the deletion. where we can see I was pushed back to the home page after deletion, which is successful, but we also invalidated that query. And while we saw it for a split second in the process of it revalidating, we did see that it was then removed after it invalidated and refreshed those results. Now, realistically speaking, for our handle on save copy and handle on save, we might or might not have to do it for those. If you think about it, if we're saving a copy and then going back to the home page, if we didn't invalidate those queries, we might not see that new copy, which we did actually see before. So what we can do is we can invalidate those queries both on save and save copy. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually create a new function just for the invalidation of the queries. So let's say function invalidate queries. I'm going to pop this inside, where then I'm going to run it right before that router push again, but then I'm also going to run it right before I push to resources, or that placement probably doesn't matter for the handle save on copy. And then for the handle on save, I'm going to do something similar. So we can go ahead and just test that out. So I'll go with my elephant friends. I'm going to go ahead and edit it, create a square out of it. Let's create a copy. We can see after it was finished, it pushed me to that new page. And now let's head back to the home page. And we can see those queries were invalidated, and I now see my elephant friend again, but in a square format. Now, before we wrap up with our individual viewer page, let's do one more thing where I'm going to head back over to my elephant, where on this info panel, we currently only show the public ID. And I want to show a little bit more information than that, because we have things like our width, our height, maybe we can even show the tags. But basically, let's fill this out with some information that we have from the asset. Now, the only information that we currently made available on the type is our height, our public ID, our secure URL, as well as the width. And there's a lot more information if we remember from inspecting the resources. So just to kind of see what's inside before we tackle this, let's console log out our resource, where once we refresh the page, we can see all the data inside. And let's do things like our bytes, the created at, maybe we want to add the original format. We can see this one's a JPEG. But back inside of our media viewer, let's find where we're setting that public ID. I'm going to get rid of the sidebar here. So I'm going to look for public ID, and I'm going to hit enter a few times until I actually find it. And here we see our info panel where I'm actually setting that public ID within the text. So let's add a few more. How about we want to break down this so we can see. We have our date created. How about we also do our width? We do a height. Let's do the format, the size, and finally, let's do the tags. And some of this, again, we already have. How about for our width and height? Let's add our width, our height. I don't think we had the date created at yet, but we do have the tags. So we can do tags and join that by a comma. Actually, that's tags with an S. And actually, we don't already have that. So anyways, we can go back to our type now and start to add the things that we don't have yet. So starting with tags, we have our tags, which is going to be an array of strings. We have our format, which is going to be a string. Our size is actually going to be available at bytes, not size. So we want to find bytes, and that's going to be a number as well. And then we have our created at date, which is going to be a string. So let's add our created at, which will be, of course, a string. But now let's head back to the media viewer and start to fill these things in. We have our size, which is bytes. We have our format. And then I think it's just the last one of our date created. So created at, but now let's wrap that with date new, or rather new date, which then will add to locale, and I'll hide myself, locale string. Now, if we head to the browser, if you tried to use tags already, we'll notice that we don't actually have them. Now, by default, the tags don't come back in the response from the resource. So we have to actually explicitly request that. So back inside of the project, I'm going to look under my pages for the resources and the asset ID. We're here. I'm going to pass in a second argument into my resources by assets, asset IDs, which I'm going to say tags true. We can see once it refreshes, everything is working as expected. Let's check that out, that info panel now, where we can see all of our different information. We have the date created, which looks nice with that locale string. We have our width, our height. We have JPEG format and our size, as well as media. Now, as far as these numbers go, these are a little bit harder to read. We can add commas here. We can probably format that size a little bit differently. And if you're following along with the project starter, I included a few functions inside of the utils file, the libutils file, which includes some functions just to format this for us, where I use ChatGPT to easily generate this. You could use whatever code generation tool or just write them yourselves if you're up for the challenge. But here I have add commas simply, which it does what it sounds like. And then we have our format bytes, which it'll dynamically format it to bytes, kilobytes, gigabytes, etc., based off of how many bytes there actually are. So at the top of my media viewer, I'm going to import format bytes and add commas from @libutils. And then I'm going to head down to where I'm actually doing those things, format bytes. And then for my numbers, specifically my width and height, I'm going to add commas to wrap that. I can do the same thing for my height. And now we can see that that's formatted a lot easier to read, where we have the comma for the width and the height, and then we can see that that's 1.9 megabytes in size. Now heading back to the gallery page, it seems pretty snappy and fast because, well, my internet's pretty fast and it's loading pretty quickly from the Cloudinary server. But what if maybe my internet's not slow? Or maybe what if the Cloudinary request or another service's request was taking a long time to load? The way that Next.js works, which inherits from React, is it's able to stream in some of these server components into the UI, where if I wanted to load this entire page, I don't need to have it completely blocked to have every request fulfilled before it actually loads on the page, where specifically, because I'm loading the contents of this gallery separately in its own server component, if that takes a long time to load, I can still render the rest of the UI before that actually finishes, so that once it does finish, it can load that itself. So we can take advantage of some of the Next.js features, specifically the loading template, in order to make that work. So back inside of the code, I pulled up the home page that's currently loading that media gallery. And as we can see inside, we're loading those resources which get passed along, but we're doing that on this server. Now, this is the layout that's currently loading any of the page contents, where we have these sidebar links that are separate from the actual children that get rendered for the page itself. But what we can do is we can create a new file that's simply called loading.tsx. And inside, I'm going to export a default function called loading. And inside, just to test this out for a second, let's just say loading. And if we try reloading the page, we should see for a split second that little loading in the top left. Now, like I mentioned before, this is particularly impactful if you have a request that's slow to load. So while this Cloudinary API request is loading pretty fast, we can kind of artificially see what this would look like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say await new promise, where I'm going to pass in a set timeout, where inside I'm going to simply resolve undefined, so it just finishes that function, but I'm going to set that timeout for 5 seconds. So what's going to happen is anytime this server component or page tries to load, it's going to get those resources, and then it's basically just going to wait for 5 seconds until it resolves. So now when we try to reload the page, we see that we have that loading indicator, and it's going to sit there for 5 seconds until it resolves. But in the meantime, we were able to see that the sidebar and the navigation were all able to completely render and be on the page and even be interactive before the actual content's loaded. Now, rather than just that little simple loading indicator, I want to just put a little Cloudinary logo inside for mine. So I'm going to go ahead and inside of Figma, I'm going to copy this as SVG. And because I can't put SVG code directly in React because React is JSX, I am using this handy tool, SVG to JSX, where I'm going to paste that in. And it's going to allow me to easily copy the SVG that's JSX ready. So now inside of my loading function, I'm going to return that SVG. And if I try to reload the page, we can see that we get that logo, but let's make that a little nicer looking. To start, I'm going to wrap that with a div. I'm going to make sure I indent that. And then on the div, I'm going to add class name. I'm going to make it a width full, height full. I'm going to use flexbox. I'm going to make the items center and justify center. So if I reload, I think that's making good progress. And I just realized I misspelled justify. So that's why it wasn't in the center to begin with. But then on the SVG itself, I'm going to add class name text zinc 200. And how about for dark mode, dark text zinc 800. And then I'm going to add animate pulse to give it a little animation. Now, the last thing that I need to do is actually change how the fill is getting applied inside of the different paths. And as we can see, this fill is currently set to black. So I'm going to set that to current color. And when I reload the page, we can see that we get that lighter logo and it has that nice little pulse indicating that it's loading. Now I'm going to go ahead and actually remove that promise because we don't need an artificial delay in that. We can see that if we refresh again, we do get it for a split second, and it's really only going to show if we actually need it there. But the cool thing is we can do that exact same thing for the media viewer as well. So what I'm going to do is under resources, where we have our dynamic route at that top level next to the layout, I'm going to simply drag that in and copy it in, where now we have that same file, but the difference is I can probably just get rid of this text Zinc 200 because it's always going to have that dark background. So that's really the biggest difference there. And now if I try to navigate to one of the images, we were able to see for a split second that logo in the background. If I refresh, we can see the same thing. Now, as far as loading animations go, we never added that loading animation for the CLD image components that we use on the gallery page. So as you remember, we created a wrapper component around that so that we were able to just add that SVG loading animation directly inside that wrapper, but still render the CLD image component pretty much as is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply get rid of CLD image, and then I'm going to import the CLD image component wrapper that we created. And if I reload the page, we can see that we get a split second of that. If I open up my network tab, let's add the fast 3G, and I refresh the page, we see that we do get that loading animation as it comes in. Now it's dark and it's probably better if we did like a light animation for this one, but I'm going to consider it out of scope for this one. So maybe that's something you can do on your own, where you can try to create a variable loading animation between whether it's light mode or dark mode based off of either the page that it's on, or even if the browser itself is in light versus dark mode. But now we get to probably my favorite part of this whole project. We're going to add some creations where we're going to have the ability to select multiple items, or maybe just a single item. And we have this little menu up here where if we click it, we're going to have a couple different options for a creation that we are able to create. One being a collage, for instance, where we'll automatically on the fly create a collage based on these two images. Now, looking at the code for a second, let's see how we're going to walk through this, where I have a little bit of UI already scaffolded for this, particularly a little dialogue that's going to allow us to preview the creation before we allow somebody to actually save it. So if we scroll down in the starter, or if you want to create your own dialogue, I currently have this dialogue where if it has a creation, it's going to show. We don't currently have that capability yet, but if we want to be able to show the creation, we're going to show it right inside of this content. We're going to say, do you want to save your creation? And then of course, we're going to give a button to save that. So let's dive right in. I'm going to search for the word option because one of the menu items had the word option in it. And we can see that we have this drop down menu where I have the first item of option. Now, of course, we want to make that a collage. So the first thing I'm going to do is change that to the word collage. But then we're going to use this drop down menu item in order to trigger that. So we're going to set up an on click handler on this where I'm going to name it handle on create collage. Now we're going to want to create this function. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to head up to the top of the page and let's add it under, let's just add it at the top of this list here, handle on create collage. I'm going to then create my little note just to make it a little bit more easy to see. But then inside of here, this is where we're going to start to manage the creation state to begin with so that we can put it in that creation flow. Now, if I look at creation itself here, it's currently not expecting any kind of shape that we're going to store that information in. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a type just so that we have an idea of what that's going to look like. So I'm going to create an interface of creation. And some of the things that we're going to want to store is, first of all, the state. So what state is that dialogue in? So I'm going to say state, and that's going to be a string. I'm going to want to store the URL. So that's going to be the URL of the creation. So I'm going to say URL equals string. And then we're going to have different types of creations. The first one's going to be a collage, of course, but if we want to do something different based off of the different types, we want to have a way to do that. So I'm going to say type equals string. But now we can take that interface and I'm going to set it on my state instance. And then we can actually set our first state where inside of handle on create collage, let's add that where we have those three different things. We have our state, we have our URL, and we have our type. And let's start to think about what kind of state we want to have. Now, if I'm immediately creating a URL, I can just add something like created. So let's add created, where maybe in the future we have some creations that require an API endpoint, which we will. So maybe for that one, it's going to be created until that finishes, maybe for a loading state, but rather let's get back to the URL where we're going to have something in there. Now we don't have that URL yet. We'll get to that. So I'm just going to add a random string. And then finally for the type, this one's going to be a collage. Now heading back to the app just for a second, I'm going to go ahead and click that plus. I'm going to click collage. And we can see that we already have that dialog because now creation is a truly value because we set that state. So what we're going to do is we're going to, first of all, we're going to create a URL for the collage, and then we're going to store it so that we can show it using that CLD image component right inside of this area. Now we already have the CLD image component imported, but if you remember, we used that get CLD image URL function in order to easily generate it where it wasn't in the context of actually displaying the image. So we're going to use that, and I'm going to say import get CLD image URL from Next.js. Spell that right. And then I'm going to take that, I'm going to scroll down to where I'm actually creating that collage. And let's say constant URL is equal to get CLD image URL. I'm going to say source is equal to, and now we need to find out what images we're actually trying to use to create a creation, right? So we're going to try to inspect the ones that are selected from within the UI. So quickly, what do I mean by that? So we have these little checkboxes here. So we're storing those selected values in the state that's already pre-configured in the starter if you're following along, but ultimately we need some way to be able to detect that these were the selected images. So if we look at the top of media gallery, I have this selected and set selected, and it's just an array of strings. And if we just take a quick look as to what I'm doing, I have a checkbox for each and every one of those images. We can see that here, where if somebody actually tries to select that checkbox, it's going to trigger that function, and it's going to simply add the public ID of that image to that list. So I'm going to comment this out for a second, and let's just console log out selected, just so that we can have an idea of what we're actually working with. So if I go ahead and select collage, we can see, make sure that this is big enough, that we have that selected value, which are those public IDs. So to get started, I'm going to just simply add the first one so we can start to construct that UI. So I'm going to say the source is going to be selected 0, which is going to be the first item in that array. We don't necessarily need to even set a URL because Cloudinary doesn't necessarily require a width and a height because it already knows that when it's trying to deliver that image. So we really only need to set a width and a height if we're trying to change those values. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to simply set that URL, and now we have that creation state that we can start to actually display it inside of the little dialog UI. Now, before we actually do that, though, I have one more thing, and we need to set a version on this URL. Now, that's going to accomplish two things. One we'll get to in a second when we're showing how to do this in the UI, but the other thing is when we're using the creation, we probably want to generate a new creation every single time that we do this. Now, if we don't, say perhaps somebody selects the same two images, we go and make changes to that image and then save it and then come back and try to create it again, it's probably going to use that cached version that it has, so it's not going to use the updated version. So we want to make sure that we're always creating a brand new creation when the user actually prompts that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set version, and let's just say date.now. So going down to the dialog UI, the first thing I'm going to do is say creation optional chain URL. So only if that exists, I'm going to show a div that includes my CLD image component. Now, as far as the CLD image component goes, it does require a width and a height, but for all of our creations, we are going to contain it to a specific width and height. And specifically, we're going to do 1200 and we're going to do by 1200. And the reason we're going to do that is if you think about a collage, it's not really going to have a dynamic value. It's going to always be a square where we're going to place our different images from within the square. Now, of course, you can make that different if you'd like. You can make all of your collages wide or tall, or maybe even have the option to change how that works. But for our purposes, I'm going to add a static 1200 by 1200 for each and every one of the creations that we're going to use. But now I can set the source as creation.url. And just as a quick note, typically, and to this point, we've set a public ID for each and every one of our sources of CLD image. Now, technically, the CLD image can take in a Cloudinary URL. However, the URL must have a version number associated with that. And why does it need a version? Well, the Cloudinary URLs are pretty tough to actually parse. And without the version number, it's pretty practically impossible to do so because there needs to be a separation between the transformations and the end where we can grab that ID. And if you don't have that, there's potential that maybe somebody's using a name that collides with one of the transformations, but we're getting into the weeds. What I'm trying to say is the version number is required for the URL if we want to use that there. So then I'm going to say alt equals creation. And then finally, we can use a property called preserve transformations. And what that's going to do is if we pass in a URL, because I'm parsing that URL, it's going to allow me to take any transformations that were inside that URL and then automatically apply them to the image that we're actually displaying. So now we have that image, and let's see if that works. But now going back to the UI for a second, let's actually test this out where I'm going to select my elephant and I'm going to click create collage, where we can see that we're immediately getting that loading UI. And we see that it is showing larger than that set 1200 by 1200. Why is that? So if you remember from earlier when we were creating our little thumbnails for our filters, we had to also set a crop of fill. Now that's important because otherwise Cloudinary is not going to just assume that we want it to be cropped to that size, where that width and height will just be used inside of the actual DOM for the image element, but it's not going to just simply crop it. So we can set a crop of fill, but because we're now going to add transformations, again, remember from earlier, we want to crop the source of the image. We don't want to crop the end of the image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say crop, and we're going to pass in an object where I'm going to say type of fill, and then I'm going to say source is true. But now going back to the UI, if I try that again, we can see that we get a nice square, which actually looks pretty similar to one of the ones we already had in there, but that's a new creation based off of that other resource that was initially taller. But now let's take those selected images and try to create a collage out of them, where let's think for a second how this would actually work. So we have our base image and we want to basically split it in half, and we can provide multiple templates for this, but we basically want to split it in half so that we have one image on one side and one image on the other. Now, Cloudinary has the ability to place layers on images, and what that means is we can either place text layers or image layers. So later you can honestly add a feature to add text to your image, but we're not going to get to that here. What we want to do is we want to place these layers so that we have two layers that represent those two images that are going to be our collage. If we head over to the Next Cloudinary documentation, we can see overlaying images under the guides section where we can see how to do just that. I'm going to select get CLD image URL, but we can see we're going to use the overlays property where we're going to pass in an array of overlays that's going to contain our images that we want to overlay, the position of it, and any effects that we might want to add to it, in particular, maybe like cropping. So let's start with our images where I'm going to now add overlays, and I'm going to create an array where let's set up that first object, and we can use the first selected item for that first overlay, where we're going to set a public ID of selected 0, and then we're going to add a position where the position is going to work where we want to just set a simple gravity. And what I mean by gravity is the focal point, if we remember from earlier, where we want to set that to west. So depending on which way my camera is, we want to set it to either the left side or the right side, the west side or the east side, which is going to tell us exactly where we want to anchor it so that when we have just half of an image, it can be either on the left or the right. So I'm going to add an object for my position, and I'm going to set gravity of west. But then we want to resize the image. So I'm going to add an effects property, which is basically just going to allow us to pass in an array of different effects that we want to apply, where I'm going to pass in an array of objects, and that first object is going to have a width of 600, which is half of the creation size. We're going to add our height of 1200, which is the full height of the creation. And then we're going to add a crop of fill, because remember, Cloudinary is not going to just assume that we want to crop it, so it's not going to use the right scale or cropping mode if we don't pass that. And then finally, we're going to add a gravity of auto, where that's going to mean that depending on the size of the image and the crop, it's automatically going to detect the most ideal location to crop it to. So if you have a wide image with an elephant on the left side, it's going to automatically crop that frame to where that elephant actually is. Now let's give this a try just to see where we're at. So let's hit add new, and we have our collage. And once we actually let it load for a second, we see that it's not quite right. So if we look at this image, we see that it's much smaller. And what's actually happening here? Well, we're cropping the image that we're displaying, but we never cropped the source image of the image itself. But on top of that, the image below is showing, and maybe we don't want that to show. Maybe we want to just make that white. So we have two problems here. First, we need to crop the image, and then we need to remove the background image, basically. So we're going to say we want to set the width of 1200, the height of 1200, which will match the creation size. And then we want to say we want to make a crop of fill for that. And let's just double check that that's working so far. And try again on my collage. And remember, we set date now, so it's always going to generate a new image. But just to try to illustrate a point that I was trying to make earlier, is we still see that it's not quite the right shape and size. Now, again, because we're not specifying that we want to crop the source of the image, we're cropping after everything occurs. And then when we're using that with CLD image, it kind of gets mixed up because now CLD image wants to pass in the responsive sizing, which is kind of the point of the tail end of the resizing. So we're going to set that as an object, and we're going to say type of fill, and we're going to say source of true. But now when we open that one up, we can see that now that elephant is taking up half of the actual size. So now let's remove the background. Now, this part's a little bit trickier because you always require a source in order to create a URL, because you ultimately need an image in order to build all this off of. And while you can maybe add like a 1 pixel by 1 pixel white image and then overlay everything on top, for our purpose, I'm just going to keep this current image that's selected as the image that we're going to be using. But what we can do is we can add an additional effect and basically turn that image into a white image. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new property of effects, where on that, I'm going to add my new object where I'm going to use the colorize property. And I'm going to say, I want to colorize it 100. And the syntax here is a little funky, but what we're going to need to do is 100. And then we're going to say, we want it as a color of white. So let's see that syntax. And you can find an example like that inside of the documentation, but we want to colorize it. We want to change the color of it. We want it to the full effect. And then we're going to set the color of white. And then just to be safe, I'm going to add a background of white as well. So let's test this out. And we can see once it loads, we have our white background and we have our elephant only on one side of the image. So now let's add that second image on the other side. So we're going to do the same exact thing that we did for the other overlay. I'm going to duplicate that, but this time we're going to use the second image selected. Now we're going to have to add some logic here to make sure we determine how many images are selected, but we'll get to that in a second. So we'll just assume that we have 2 selected for just making sure this works. But the only other thing that I need to do is remember the gravity is going to set which side of the image that it needs to be anchored to. So for this one, we're going to make it east. So now how about we select the elephant and we select this picture from Athens. I'm going to click create collage. And once it loads, we can see that we have our beautiful collage where we have both of our images, where again, the gravity is automatically detecting where it is in the image. And based on the size of the image, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a perfect inner crop. Now there's something coming out soon that's going to help you with that kind of thing, crop of auto, but we can see that it was nicely cropped and it's going to give us that collage effect. Now, as I pointed out, we only want to be able to create a collage if we have 2 images. So the way that we're going to handle this is we're going to wrap all of our menu items based off of those constraints that we actually have. So for this particular one, we only want to show the menu item for collage if we actually have enough items to show that. So I'm going to say selected length is greater than, or rather, greater than 1, because we can set different templates up for different collage groups. And then I'm going to say, and then we'll show our menu item. So now in the UI, if I only have one selected, it's not going to show anything. But as soon as I select another one, we now see collage. Now, as I mentioned before, I want to be able to create collages based off of multiple images, not just 2 images. So now we can try to create the concept of templates, where we're going to create templates based off of how many images we have. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually abstract this image into a lib file. So inside of my sidebar here, let's find where we have our lib already. I'm going to collapse down the app. Where we have our lib, I'm going to create a new file, not a folder, a new file called creations.ts. And you can really name this whatever you want, but I'm going to create all the creations logic inside this file. But let's export a function called getCollage. And inside collage, it's going to take a list of public IDs, which will be an array of strings. Or string. Now heading back over to the media gallery for a second, I'm going to lift up all this code that we're using to create our actual URL, and I'm going to simply paste it into this new file. Now, of course, we need to import our Next.Cloudinary library, so I'm going to use my handy command period, and I'm going to add that import for us. But we can see that we're also getting a type error on selected, and that's because we're not using that as the variable name. So I'm going to pass in and replace the selected item or the selected name with public IDs. But now we have this URL and we can simply return the URL to start. And then let's head back over to the media gallery and just wire this up just to make sure that it's working properly. So at the top of the file, first I can get rid of getCLD image URL. I'm going to then import getCollage from, at lib creations. And now let's use that. So I'm going to look for my handle on create collage. And how about let's just pass this in as get collage, where we're going to pass in our selected. Now, you know me, I like to make sure that this is working. So I'm going to hit the plus sign, hit collage, and we still get our collage. So now let's actually create some of these templates, where I'm going to create a constant of collage templates. I'm going to set that equal to an empty object, where what we'll do is we'll use a key of how many different items that we have inside of that array. So we can dynamically pull that template based off of how many public IDs we have. So let's start with the first one that we already have of 2. And I'm going to create a function out of this where I'm going to pass those public IDs as that actual value. Now, again, we want to be able to use the array of strings as the type for that. But then I can determine what all the different properties that I want to store in this template. Now, kind of looking at this for a second, we're always going to use the first item as the source. It's always going to be 1200 by 1200. We always want to make sure that we're cropping at the source of the image. We always want to set a version, but we could probably use these overlays as the basis of our templates. Now, again, we're probably going to want to keep the effects for each and every one because we want to have the underlying images white. So let's now just use only these overlays as the basis of what we want to do. So I'm going to cut out these overlays and I'm going to return an object that includes those overlays. But now what I want to do is I want to try to dynamically pull out the template that I'm going to use for that image creation. So I'm going to copy collage templates and we're going to say constant template is equal to collage templates. And let's use public IDs.length as the way that we're going to access that. Now we can see that TypeScript doesn't like that. And why doesn't it like it? Well, how about let's go back up to collage templates, and we never set a type for the type of data that this is going to expect. So let's say this is going to be a record where it's going to be a number, not a string like you might usually expect. And then we're going to have a function where I believe that's a capital F. But now let's see if that fixed our error. It did. And we can, first of all, let's say if we don't have a template, do we throw an error? Do we just return? How about let's just for now return so that we're not interrupting anything. But now we can actually use this template to create our dynamic properties. So at the very end of this, I'm going to spread out where we have our template. And remember, that's going to be a function where I'm going to pass in my public IDs. Now, one thing I just thought of is we see that we get a type error over on Media Gallery because the URL could potentially be undefined. Now, because we do want to make sure that we always have the right number of images, maybe it makes sense to use throw error anyways. It shouldn't ever get to that place because that means we're displaying it in the UI where we shouldn't be. So let's just try to use throw new error template not defined. And we can see that we no longer get that type error inside of the Media Gallery itself. So as expected, it should work, and it does. So next, let's try to add another template. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clone a number 2. I'm going to make sure I add my comma up top. I'm going to set my key of 3. But now what we want to do is we want to create 3 overlays to have 3 different positions of where we place these images. So we're going to leave the first one as is, or you could use, you want to think about the layout that you want to create. And the layout that I'm going to create is I'm going to have the first one just be the tall image. And then the second 2, I'm going to have the 2 halves of images. So we're going to leave that first one as is. I'm going to duplicate this second one. But what we want to do is we want to set the height of 600 for both of these, because again, they're going to be half of the height. And then we want to update the gravity based off of where we want them to be. So how about we make this first one, we're going to make it northeast. So it's going to be in the top right corner. And then this second one, we're going to have as southeast or the bottom right corner. But of course, we need to make sure that we update the public ID that we're trying to get out of that array. And before we get started, I uploaded a few more images before we test this out. And while I like the elephant and Greece, I just want to have a little bit more variety as we're having fun with this. So I'm going to select the penguins this time. I'm still going to select the elephant because I like the elephant. But how about for the last one, let's do the northern lights. I think that'll be a cool vibe. So I'm going to hit add again. Let's select the collage and we can see that it's creating itself in the background. Let's see what we get here. Or it might take a little bit extra longer because we had 3 images this time, but we can see that worked really well. We have our tall image. We can see that it's beautifully cropped. Then we have our elephant, and then we have our northern lights. So let's do one more. Let's do a 4 where we have a grid of 4 images. And after that, I'll let you take it from here. So I'm going to clone my number 3. And as we're doing this, there's probably a good way to kind of abstract the different locations. Maybe you have a function that creates a top right corner or a bottom left corner, but we'll let you be able to abstract that kind of thing on your own. For now, I'm just going to duplicate these just to make it easier. So let's create our for key. And then again, because we used that same pattern on the right where we created those 2 items, I'm going to do the same thing on the left where I'm going to add my first and second slot of the array, where we're going to make both of these 600 in height. Now the first one's going to be northwest, the second one's going to be southwest, and the only thing I need to do on top of this is just adjust the IDs that I'm using for the right side, since I'm now using those for the left side. So of course we now have 2 and we have 3. So let's go ahead and add one more image to the mix. How about this picture with the pyramid? I'm going to hit add and collage. And we can see once it's finished, we have our nice collage of 4 different images. So once we're happy with our collage, now we want to have the ability to save it into our library. That's the whole point, right? We don't want to just look at this collage. We want to save it so that we can use it, we can share it. So now we have this save to library button at the bottom of this UI that we can wire up to do just that. So back inside the code where I have that dialog UI, I'm going to scroll down until I see that save to library button. And of course on that button, I'm going to add on click. Let's add handle on save creation. So now let's take that function just to make sure that you kind of see what I'm writing here is an on click handle on save creation. But now let's scroll up and actually add that function, where how about we add it after we actually define the create collage. I'm going to name that with my little comment as I usually do. And it's not coming out. There we go. And what we're going to do is inside this function, we're now going to upload that image similar to what we were doing inside of our media viewer when we were uploading, or rather saving, our image. Now, to make this a little bit quicker and easier, I'm hopping over to my media viewer file where we have that handle on save copy. And I'm just going to grab the code from there where we preload that image with that fetch. Now, it'll probably be unnecessary since we're showing it, but because we're showing it in the image, it works a little bit differently. Nonetheless, let's just include that fetch. It'll be quick if it's already created. And then we can grab that upload code, and we're going to want to invalidate the queries after, but we're going to do that a little bit differently where we're going to add the resource since we're on the gallery page. So I'm not going to include that one. I'm only going to include that fetch and the actual upload request. So inside of my handle on save creation, I'm going to go ahead and just paste that in. And of course we need the URL for that. So that's going to be creation URL. And of course it needs to exist, but it might not exist. So we want to make sure that we handle the event that somebody clicks that save and it doesn't exist, even though technically if we're only showing the UI, it needs to. So we'll say if type of creation dot URL equals string. Make sure you see this. We're going to simply return for now. And we can see that I still get errors because I need to first of all make this async. And I'm realizing this needs to be not string, not just a string. And we can see that the other one goes away. But we can see that we also want to be able to pass in, I can get rid of the optional chaining for this one. We want to pass in that URL as the body of the request. And then ultimately we're going to get this data, and let's console log this out just to see if it's working. So let's go ahead and hit save to library. And of course we need to wait for that upload to actually finish. And let's see if we get a response out of this. And we can see that our data comes back with our new upload. So I'm going to copy that URL, or rather the secure URL. And if I go to this, we can see that we have our creation. Now, if we have a successfully saved creation, we want to do 2 things. First of all, I want to dismiss this UI, but also I want to push that new resource into our actual resource gallery so that when I hit close here, it's actually going to show up. So the first thing I'm going to do is, if we remember our use resources hook, we have this add resources function, which allows us to set the resource into state and then eventually invalidate it. And we're returning it from that hook. So I'm going to go ahead and destructure add resources from that. And if I now scroll down to my handle on save creation, I can say add resources, where I can pass in that data as an item of that array. Now we're also using this creation and set creation state in order to kind of determine where we're at with that creation. So we use the state of created when we want to first pop up that dialog, we set that URL and the type. So we want to also reset that so that this goes back to undefined, and then it dismisses that dialog and generally just resets that creation state. So I'm going to go down and I'm also going to add set creation undefined. Now, finally, because we're using these selected items in order to create it, after we dismiss that UI and handle the save the creation, we should also reset the selection because the intent is to use those, create it, and then save it. It's not necessarily meant to continue doing more and more things. So as a convenience, let's also dismiss the selected UI. So on our selected state, we can also use the set selected function where we can revert it back to its default state of just an empty array. So if I head back down, I can also say set selected. I'm going to make that an empty array. So now this time when I go ahead and try to create a collage, we can now save it to the library. And once it finishes, we can see that it was pushed into that state and everything was reset. So now we can start to interact with that particular image. Now, if you notice, whenever we try to save to library, if I go ahead and select two of my images again and open up that dialog, we never gave any user feedback if it was actually saving. So it kind of looked like the UI was just stalled when we pushed that button. So similar to what we did with deleting, let's update this button to have a little loading indicator. So to do this, we're going to manage it with our creation state, where we're going to set a new value for state whenever we do this. So I'm going to use this same set creation function, where this time I'm going to pass in a function as the argument, because what we're going to do is we're going to take the previous value and we're going to create a new object that first off, we're going to spread out that previous value. But then because we want to keep all the previous attributes, including the URL and the type, but then we're going to say state is saving. Now we can see that we get a type error because of previous, because it could potentially be undefined. So let's just say if previous, more of an edge case, let's just return. Now, if we head down to the modal UI, let's scroll down to that button where we're going to dynamically show a different save button, where let's first say creation state equals saving. If we have that saving state, we're going to show a different icon, but let's have that first, where if we do not have that state of saving, we'll then show that save button. So let's go borrow that same loading spinner from the other page, where again, going back to where we deleted the item, we can see we have this loader 2 with the animate spin. So let's go ahead and copy that. I'm going to go ahead and paste that directly into that existing place. And as usual, I can use command period to automatically update that import. And now let's give that a try. So now if I try to hit save to library, we can see that we get that nice little loading spinner as it was actually saving. That time it was fast, but in case it's slow, it just gives a little bit better of a feedback of what's going on. But we probably also want to make sure that this doesn't fire an additional save if somebody were to click it again. And again, we can go back to whether we want to use a disabled attribute or we can do it via JavaScript. So for now, let's just do it with JavaScript, where I'm also going to say if the creation or creation state equals saving. So now if I try to hit that multiple times, it's only going to fire that once and save it to the library. And then once it's complete, push that one instance in. Okay, so I think that does a pretty good job at managing our collage and our general workflow for being able to add those creations. But what's next? So if we want to select some of these other images, what if I want to select this penguin and I want to have it maybe automatically zoom into that penguin using some kind of animated effect? Now, what I can do is I can go up to my plus sign, and then since we don't currently have one, it's showing none for just one, but maybe we can show an animation. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new menu item where we're going to have a similar constraint. The first thing I'm going to do is duplicate that. But what we're going to do is this time we're going to say if selected length equals 1, we're going to allow someone to create an animation. So of course we need to upload this callback handle on create animation, where now we can scroll back up, and how about we make this underneath where we're creating our collage. So I'm going to add function handle on create animation. I'm going to add my little note as usual. And we can do the same kind of thing that we did with the collage. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that set creation code. And we can probably technically just add the URL here because we're only going to create one instance of it. But I like the idea of keeping that code organized inside of the creations lib so that it's just an easy way to find all the different creations that we're going to make. So I'm going to get this seeded with a get animation function where let's head over to lib, where I can head down to the, how about the bottom of the file, and I'm going to say function get animation. Let's add a little note here for separation. And we're going to do a similar thing to what we did with our collage. So I'm going to go ahead, except we're not going to do a template this time since we're only going to have one. Later, if you want, maybe you can take multiple images and create a frame by frame animation. But for now, let's just copy this get URL function, paste it inside, but this time we're going to use a different method of how we actually create our different creation. Now let me first add this as my array of strings to make sure that we have that typed out properly. But this time we're going to create a zoom image, and we're going to use an effect called zoom pan. So what I can do on this is I can simply say zoom pan, set that to true. And when it comes to cropping, by default, if you remember, the library uses gauto or gravity of auto, and that actually conflicts with the zoom pan feature. So we're going to add a gravity of center. Now, heading back for a second to the dialog inside of Media Gallery that we're using to actually display the creation image, this crop mode that we have on here conflicts with that same gravity of auto. Now, if you remember, we added that in the first place because we were just trying to preview our image, and any creation that we create will be returned as 1200 by 1200. So we actually no longer need that. So I'm going to get rid of the crop on that preview image, where now we're just displaying a 1200 by 1200 and we're preserving the transformations of our creation URL. But if we now head back to the creations file, we need to make sure that we do actually export our get animation function so that we can now import it into our media gallery. So if I head back up to where we're using that, we have our get animation. I'm going to hit command period so that I can update that import. And of course, we're no longer creating a collage, we're creating an animation. And now let's give that a try, where I'm going to go ahead and select this penguin. I'm going to hit plus, hit animation, and this one might take a little bit longer than the others because it's a heavier processing in order to create an animation, a GIF, of course. So, well, that was decently quick, but we can see that it's zooming in to the focal point of the image, which is pretty cool. Now, if you noticed, it stopped. It doesn't loop by default, but we can really easily enable that. Now, all we need to do is back where we have our zoom pan defined, I'm just going to simply pass in a string of loop. Now, just as a quick note, if you want to take that further, you can actually define this as an object where you can pass in some custom options, such as maybe you want to zoom into a specific region, or maybe you want to, I don't know, just do some more advanced effects with it. Check out the documentation for zoom pan. There's some pretty cool things you could do with it. But for now, I'm just interested in focusing in on that and zooming and then doing a loop with the animation. So now let's try this again with our same penguin friend. It should generate a new image because I'm using that version number, of course. But once we get it, we can see that we get that lovely animation. Let's see if it loops, and it does. So that worked perfectly, and we were able to give a cool animation effect for any of the images that we want to select. Now, as a final creation, we're going to create a color pop. And what do I mean by color pop? Well, let's think about this elephant for a moment, where what we're going to do is we're going to desaturate the background so that the only color in the image is our elephant friend himself. And the way that we're going to do that is a little bit creative, where the first thing we'll do is we'll remove the background, kind of similar to, if you remember, how we have this option to remove background. We're going to do that, but we're going to do it in an API endpoint so that we can track its usage, or rather the removal. We're going to then upload that separately, because then we'll desaturate the original image and then overlay on top the image with the color. So let's start off by creating the trigger mechanism, where we have our animation and our collage. So let's now add another one, and we're going to call this color pop. And if you notice, this isn't in ABC order with collage, but it doesn't matter because this is only showing at more than one, and these are showing at only one. So you can kind of set that up how you want, depending on your use case. But now let's update that on click handler, and let's call this handle on create color pop, or yeah, it looks like we have create in all those. But then underneath all my other ones, let's just clone this one. I'm going to now rename this on create color pop. I'm going to say created color pop, but now our URL is going to work a little bit differently. Now, this is going to be an asynchronous process where we're going to do this in an API endpoint because we need to do that extra processing. It's a little bit more complex in composing this image. So we're going to first create that image using our API endpoint, and then we'll set that creation data. But if you remember earlier, we were talking about how we were using different states for our creation, where we're going to create a creating state so that while that's loading, it's going to be able to show us a little animation. But let's first set up the actual image itself, and then we'll get to that loading state. So inside of my app API directory, I'm going to create a new folder called creations. And inside that, I'm going to create a new folder called color pop. And then finally inside that, I'm going to clone one of my existing routes. Let's just clone the upload route so that we can kind of start off with some of the existing boilerplate. Now, we'll be using some of this existing code. Specifically, we'll be taking in the public ID that we want to create this out of, but we're not going to use a URL, so we can get rid of that. But we are going to need to upload this image in order to get that removed background variation, or rather store the variation with the background removed. So we're going to keep some of those upload options, but first we need to create that URL that we're going to use to remove the background. So at the top, I'm going to additionally import getCldImage URL from Next.js, and then I'm going to use that to create my const background removed URL. And let me hide the sidebar just to give us some extra room here, where I'm going to run that function. I'm going to pass in the source as my public ID, and I'm going to add remove background set to true. Now, another important factor about this is when we upload that image, or rather when we create the URL and then we pass it along, we want to make sure that that's always going to be a PNG because we want to preserve that transparency. And as I mentioned earlier, when you have format of auto, which is default with getCldImage URL, you might have a different way of, or rather the format might be detected in a different way that it is in the browser because it's in that node environment. So let's add a format of ping explicitly there. And then I'm also going to pull off the quality attribute because we don't want to mess with the quality since we're still trying to maintain the default image, or rather the source image. We just want the background removed from it. And then as we remember we did in other creations, we're just going to set a version where we're going to use date.now. And that's not going to really matter what version or what date that we set since it's going to be on the server time. It's just the fact that we're trying to get a unique version for that. But then since we have this background removed URL, before we go forward and try to start to compose that image, let's test this out and just wire up the workflow so that we can actually see it happening in progress. So I'm going to go ahead and comment out this upload code, and then I'm going to just simply pass back this URL as my background removed URL. Now inside of my handle on create color pop function, I can now await fetch my API where it's the creations color pop endpoint. I'm going to pass my method of post, my body, which is going to be json.stringify, including my public ID, which will be the selected 0. Remember, our selected array is going to include those public IDs, so we're going to grab the first one. And then, of course, I need to make this function async. But the result of this is going to include that URL, so I'm going to simply destructure that once we get that response. And I'm going to need to make sure I pass on a then, so that I can actually turn that response into JSON before I pass it through, where ultimately I'll take that URL and pass that right along to set creation. So now heading back, let's test this out where let's pick out this picture from Athens, and I'm going to go ahead and click plus, color pop, and it looks like we have an issue. So let's look at the web console for a second, and it looks like we're getting those 423s. Now, if you remember, the 423 status means that it's processing, and we have a little bit of an issue there where we can see once it was updated, we were able to get that actually added into the UI, which is great. But in the meantime, we need to actually pull for that background to be removed before we can actually display it. Now we could probably try to fix up the UI so that while it's pulling, it's going to show properly inside of here. But if you remember, we're going to take the result of that removed background and we're going to actually overlay it on the original image. So we're going to need it before we get back to this part of the UI. So that's what we need to do inside of the endpoint so that we can pull for that image, make sure that the background is removed, and then we'll apply it to the original image. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to create an async function that I'm going to call check status. Now this check status is going to take in a URL, and that URL is going to be whatever we pass it, and in particular, it's going to be this background removed URL. Where let's set this up, and the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to fetch that image. So I'm going to say constant results is equal to, or let's call this response, is equal to await fetch that URL, and then I'm going to see if that response is okay, or it's not an error or something like that, where the 423 would say that it's not okay. So I'm going to say if the response is okay, and if it is okay, I'm just going to simply return true, because the point of this isn't to get that URL, it's just to check if it is okay. So we're just going to try to return something. Now, after that, if it's not okay, there's two things I want to do. First of all, I just want to put in a little bit of a delay just so that we're not spamming this endpoint, but then I'm going to set this up so that it's triggering recursively. So if it's not okay, it's going to check it again. If that's not okay, it's going to check it again, and so on until it is okay. And then it will basically return that true again. It will resolve and we can move on. So I'm going to say await new promise. I'm going to grab resolve, and inside I'm going to set timeout, where inside there, I'm just going to simply make this happen for 500 milliseconds, again, just so we're not spamming this thing. And then we can say resolve undefined. But after we get through that, after that little delay, I'm going to return this check status function, and I'm going to pass through that same URL. Now I think I need to have my await on here, but Once we now have this all set up, I can now try to use this check status. So I'm going to run await check status. I might not need that await in that context, but this is going to allow us to now pass in our background removed URL. So again, let's walk through this flow. Once I check my status of the URL, it's going to first try to get that. And then if it is okay, if it's a 200 level response or whatever that's going to trigger the okay, it's just going to return true. It's good. We can continue on. But if it's not okay, let's wait for 500 milliseconds and then check it again. If that's not okay again, we'll check it again, and so on until it is okay. And then we'll continue through where now we know after this that it is okay, and we can just return that with a response. So let's try this again. How about with our penguins this time? I'm going to go ahead and trigger the color pop. We can see that it might take a moment where this is where we're going to create the creating status, if we remember. But once that UI pops up, we can see that it's starting to load, and then we have the image with the background removed. Now, one thing you might notice is the image is still tall. We just never cropped it, where the other ones, again, remember, we need to return an image with the background or with the image already cropped. But we're going to handle that afterwards, so let's move on. Now, once we have that background removed URL, we know that everything is okay. We can now upload this so that we can then use it later. So I'm going to uncomment this code, and we don't need all this stuff. Maybe one thing that I usually like to do is I like to tag it where we can say something like background removed. I also like to sometimes tag with the original so that if I ever need to reference it, I can. So let's say original, where we can pass in that public ID of the original image. But then I can continue on. I can pass in that background removed URL as my upload. So then once we have those results, we can now pass that back, but we're going to use that as a creation URL. But first, let's just pass back that results.secure URL just to make sure that that process is working in the first place. So I'm going to trigger it again on the same penguins because we know that we're going to create a unique process for all of that. But we can see now we're going to get that URL and it's working. So now I'm going to go ahead and copy the same code that I created for the background. I'm going to paste that below the results, but this time it's going to be the creation URL. We can pass in we're going to keep that public ID. We don't need to remove the background. We don't need to change the format. We don't need to change the quality. We do want to set the version. But one thing we're going to do, we're going to say grayscale true, and then we're going to add an overlay, which is where we're going to add the new image with the background removed. So let's say overlays, where we're going to specify our array with our object with a public ID will be our results.public ID. Now, if you remember, we also need to make sure that we crop this image before passing it along. So I'm going to set my width of 1200, my height of 1200, and then I'm going to set up my crop property where, of course, we need to make sure we're cropping the source of this. We're going to set a type of fill, and then I'm going to also set a gravity of center just to make sure that those two images are going to be aligned as they're getting added together. But then I'm going to take that creation URL and I'm going to pass that back as my response. But now heading back to the browser, let's give this a try. I'm going to hit color pop, and remember, it'll take a little second. We're going to fix that delay so that we can actually show some kind of UI, but we can see we get our color pop. We have a background with the desaturation and we have our colors. Now let's maybe try that again with, I think the Athens one might be cool, or at least it might be pretty obvious of the actual result, but we're going to go through that background removal process. Now, the first time an image has its background removed, it'll take extra long, and then other images will be quicker, but we can see we now get that same effect. But I'm going to try this one more time because my elephant friend was the original one that I wanted to test this out on. We can see once it goes through that process of removing it, we get our pop-up with the creation, and we can see that we have a nice pop effect, color pop effect for our elephant. But now let's fix that little UI issue. Now, the reason it's having that delayed effect and showing the modal, if you remember, we're first hitting that endpoint, and when we hit that endpoint, it can potentially take a little bit of time. So what we want to do is we want to put our creation modal in a state that indicates that it's currently loading, but so that it can show immediately and then show that kind of loading indicator. So we're going to take our set creation, and the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to set our creation, but let's put that in a state of creating. Now, of course, we're not going to have a URL yet, so let's just make that undefined. It can really be any value at this point. Looks like URL doesn't like that though, so let's go ahead and let's make that optional. And if we head back to the UI and try this out, we can see that it does show that UI right away as it's making that API request. So that definitely is an improvement already. But now let's show some kind of loading indicator. Now, heading down to our creation dialog, we have a bunch of content that we probably only want to show if we're able to actually save, where we're trying to show something before we're ready to save. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap everything in here to check that it's in the right state. And if we remember, so first off, I'm going to use the includes method like we did earlier, and I'm going to say we have two states. We have created and we have saving that I want to include in this. So I'm going to check if these includes my creation state, and if it does, then I'm going to wrap everything inside. I'm going to add a fragment so that I can control all these components inside. Let's just go ahead and indent this twice. I'm going to add that fragment, and then I'm going to close that off. So now if it's in that state, looks like I spelled that wrong. If it's in that state, we'll show what's inside. Now it looks like I can't just pass this in as an undefined value. So I'll first check and see if that exists first, and then I'll check if it's included in that state. But now if I try to select it and go to color pop, we can see that it pops up as basically an empty dialog, and then it brings it in when it actually has that URL. So now let's add that loading spinner. So right above it, I'm going to basically do the same thing. Let me close that off. But I'm going to say that I want this to be in the state of creating before I actually show anything. But once we're in that state, I'm going to show that same loading icon that we used elsewhere. So what is that? Loader, because when we were using that for the save button, so that was just a little bit down. I'm going to grab that same loader and I'm going to go ahead and paste that inside. Now, of course, we're going to want that to be a little bit bigger, and I know I want this to be 12 by 12. I also want to put a wrapper around this because I don't want it to just be hugged up tight next to the loader itself. I want to give it a little bit of breathing room. So I'm going to also wrap this with a div, where on that div, I'm going to set a class name, first of all, flex, because I want to items center. I want to justify center, but then I'm going to add p of, let's call this 12. But now that we have that loading indicator, let's give that a try. I'm going to hit color pop again, and we see that we have that nice spinning animation before the color pop actually comes up. So we're indicating that it's currently loading, and then we get the second loading indicator, which maybe we can reduce that a little bit in some way. But either way, we're able to get that experience where we're showing that it's processing before it actually gets to the image itself. But then, of course, I think I like this one, so I'm going to just save this one to the library. Now, these creations wouldn't be fun unless I added some icons, so let's quickly add some icons to the different options that we have available. Now, heading back into Lucid, I think I like this layout panel left for my collage one. I think that probably indicates a good value on that. For my animation, I found this square stack one that I think looks pretty good. It shows that it's going in frames. And then for color pop, I had a little bit of a hard time trying to think this through of what I wanted to use, but ultimately I settled on using drop. So that indicates that I have a drop of color. So for my animation, I'm going to add my square stack icon. I'm going to make sure I import that in. I'm going to add my class name with a width of 4, a height of 4, and also a margin right of 2, just to give a little space. I'm going to copy that and paste it into color drop, where I'm going to use the droplets. I'm going to need to make sure I import that as well. And then finally, for my collage, it's going to be layout panel left, and I'll go ahead and import that one as well. So now back in the browser, I can open up that menu and I see my animation and my color pop. Now let's select one more so that we have for the to selected option, where now we can see the collage. And of course, that's not incredibly necessary, but it gives it a nice touch so that we can kind of have a good visual reference of what we're selecting. Now I added all these creations to my media library every time I created one, but I don't have a good way of only seeing the animations. What if I wanted to kind of filter out all the originals and I just wanted to see the fun ones that I created? Now what we can do is we can add a new navigation item. So if we select this, we go to our creations page, and on that creations page, we only query for things that contain that specific tag related to creations. So that also means that we need to only tag our creations with a specific tag. So let's start off by creating that new page where we can include those creations. So under the pages route, I'm going to create a new folder called creations, where I'm going to just simply duplicate this original page that I have. And if we remember, this is our default homepage in its current state, where this is just going to query all of our library resources. Remember, we're tagging those originally so that we can add those to the page. We pass them into media gallery from our server response, and then we also pass in that tag so that we pass along the information to make that request on the client as well. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to query for those images that only match that tag, but we haven't yet added that tag. So I'm going to first open up my .env.local and let's create a new tag for creations. And let's call this simply creations. Now copying that value, let's head back over to our page. And I want to make sure that when I query for my resources by tag, I'm going to query for that new creations tag. And that when I pass it into media gallery, I'm querying for that as well. Now, if I try to go to that creations page, it's understandably empty because again, I no longer have any of those creations actually tagged as a creation. So I'm going to head back to my photos, and what we're going to do is we're going to create new creations, and every time we do, we're going to make sure we add that tag. So let's head over to our media gallery where we find our handle on save creation function, and inside of that upload request, let's add another field where we're going to call that tags, and let's pass in that tag that we just created, or let me copy that value, and it's going to be process.env, that tag name, and I'm just going to wrap this in string just to be sure. Now that means over in our upload routes, we need to be able to accept those tags and then pass them into our upload options. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to destructure those tags, and we can see that we're already adding upload tags specifically for those library tags. And if we remember the logic here for a second, we're currently checking if type of public ID equals string, and that's if we're passing in an image that already exists because we want to overwrite it. So where we have this options.tags, this is because we're just tagging every image that's new with that general library tag. So we're going to do the same thing, but this time we're going to spread out our tags if they are available. And we can even make this an empty array by default. That way, if we don't pass in tags, that we're not going to have any issues. But now let's try that one more time. I'm going to go ahead and select my elephant friend again. Let's try to make the color pop again. Now, once this loads, I'm going to go ahead and save this to library. We can see it was pushed into the media library, but now let's check and see if it was actually available as a creation. So I'm going to go to creations, and we can see that it's there because it's now tagged as creation, and we're querying for only those creations on this page. Now let's add one more. Let's select the Northern Lights and our penguins. Let's do a collage just so that we at least have two there. I'm going to save this to library. We have it in our library, and then inside of creations, we now have two. But now we still have one big issue in that we have no way of actually navigating there unless we manually go there, and that's not good UX. So let's add a sidebar link for this. If I head over to my pages directory here, I'm going to go down until I see my layout. Now inside of my layout, I have this component called sidebar links. And not to go too deep into this, but again, we're rendering a server component as the default layout, but then I'm using this sidebar links as a client component so I can determine the path name and show some kind of indicator that that link is the active link with some styling. But inside of sidebar links, I can now just add a new path. That new path is going to be creations, and then I can call that label of creations. Now, of course, we want to also assign an icon image for this like we usually do. And then for this icon, I like the idea of sparkles for this. So I'm going to use sparkles. So I'm going to call this sparkles, and then I'm going to import that. And we can see that it's nicely displayed on the sidebar here. If I select creations, we can see that it loaded that page with just the creations. Now, there's so many things that you can do to take this project beyond what we created. Whether you want to add more creations, maybe you can add favorites, where you add a tag if somebody favorites an image. But there's so many transformations and effects that you can really have a lot of fun with building out your own Google Photos clone. Now, as a reminder, if you want to check out the full demo, or if you even want to contribute to this demo, definitely check out Photobox, where you can check it out at photobox.dev, where you can see all the features that I built into it, and hopefully you can contribute a feature to it too. I hope this has been a fun project for you to learn through all the intricacies of Next.js and using these different image editing techniques. I know I had a ton of fun building it, but what's your favorite Google Photos feature? Or what's your favorite feature that you're going to add to your own application? Let us know in the comments. And remember, head over to cld.media/freecodecamp so you can make sure you claim your bonus 3 credits. I'm Colby Fayock, and thanks FreeCodeCamp for this collaboration. Thanks for watching.